Thank you, Erica. She's heard me do this enough times now. She knows that I like to get a response. I have small kids. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute. I want to thank everyone in the room and online for joining us today for this conversation about effective partnerships between cities and their anchor institutions. And we really have an extraordinary group of leaders who have played an extraordinary role in building those partnerships. I think we're going to learn a lot today. I want to say a special, well, first let me do some housekeeping. This is a conversation that includes not only those in the room, but those who are watching our live webcast, and to those who watch it later in time, we say hello. But for those of you who are live and those in the room, we encourage you to share your thoughts through Twitter using the @Urban hashtag. In addition, on your seats, there was a card which is for Q&A, which we'll have at the end of each of the panels. And we also encourage those of you who are online to send your questions online to events@urban.org. That's events@urban.org, and we can bring everyone into the conversation. I also want to say thank you to the Casey Foundation for supporting Urban, and we're excited that we have Charles Ruthizer here with us today, who will be on the panel. And also say thank you to the Ford Foundation for supporting the production and the development of Striking a Local Grand Bargain, which is the report that is, many of these, our speakers today were participates in, and that is the sort of basis for today's conversation. Here at the Urban Institute, we were founded in 1968 in response to the riots in the cities, and sort of central to our core mission and very being for over 5 decades has been to pioneer innovative research methods and to bring a deeper understanding to housing and community development issues. We have 10 different research centers on many, many other issues, including health and tax and criminal justice, but the health of our cities is central to why we are here. We have many, many researchers who have long worked to ensure that insights from our work are accessible to those who are leading policy and practice in our cities. For example, and we have the folks who run this today, Urban has a program called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is really a group of leaders in 37 different cities, and we have a couple of them here today, which try to help local evidence-based, data-driven partners by creating a community of practice, really help to strengthen the health of their cities. And our hometown of DC, as we were just talking about, is a place where we try to bring evidence that we have to bear into action in our hometown. And in fact, I just I just gave my chief of staff, who just left Urban, to work for the deputy mayor on the DC's economic development strategy. But today's event is led by a new center at Urban, which we call our Policy Advisory Group, led by the extraordinary Erica Pothig. And PAG, which is an unfortunate acronym, is focusing on expanding Urban's capacity to bring insights from research to policy and practice and to make research actionable, with a special focus on connecting more and more of our work to leaders at the local level. And colleagues from PAG and the Metropolitan Housing and Community Center, Erica Pothig, Nancy Pindus, and Liza Getzinger, co-authored the report with Neil Kleiman that we're going to start this event by talking about today. In every city across the country, there is a focus on what we like to call inclusive growth. You have cities that are thriving, but not everyone in the community is coming along. And we need to make sure that that economic engine is bringing opportunity to more of the citizens. And then there are other cities that are still waiting for that spark. Waiting for the thing that is going to make sense for their strategy, given their history, their unique assets. In all of those communities, anchor institutions, the eds and meds, as some people like to call them, are essential players. And those institutions need the cities to thrive on their own, to be able to attract talent, to be able to attract students, to be able to be the kind of lively institution that makes them strong in their field, helps them advance their competitive advantage. And it is that shared interest that I think is ultimately in the health of urban areas, that is making these partnerships between anchor institutions and city government and the other nonprofits that are important in the community and the business community and philanthropy altogether increasingly see the benefit of collaboration. That collaboration over time has often taken a deal-by-deal or transactional focus. Somebody's got a new building. Well, what are the things we're going to get from you in exchange for that new building? But increasingly, there is an understanding, and many of those who have been focused on anchor institutions we have to thank for this, that a concerted collective strategy is the way in which we're able to maximize the value of what the different partners bring to the table. This report that Neil's going to describe for us today discusses the different strategies that are in different places. And one of the things we learn is that it's not a cookie cutter. The thing that works in one place isn't going to work everywhere else. Many of the challenges are shared across our cities, but many are unique and require special tools. And the benefit of creating a community of learners across these different kinds of partnerships is to figure out what you can import from where and where you need to innovate, and then share what you learn with others. The National Resource Network has helped to pioneer local engagement and strategic partnerships in many of the cities that we'll hear about today. It grew out of the Obama administration's Strong Cities, Strong Communities initiative, and it works with local leaders to address these kinds of challenges. We appreciate their support and partnership in making this work possible for us here, and their partnership on this report, which they published. Neil Kleiman, who I will turn it over to in just a moment, is Director of Policy and Evaluation for the National Research Network. He's also a clinical professor at NYU and Director of NYU Wagner's Innovation Labs. And he's the author of the report that we'll start today off by hearing a little bit more about. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah. Great to be here at Urban Institute. And this report that we issued, which is going back a bunch of months now, is really an action-oriented report. And we wrote it to be a framework for cities around the country and for anchor institutions, and it has been. So even talking to Mayor Duncan from Waco, who we'll hear more from, it's still active in his community and working with Scranton, Pennsylvania, and even talking to San Francisco and many other cities that have used this document as something to frame their efforts to have a closer collaboration between city priorities and what anchor institutions can do. But it's good to have this conversation today because this report certainly didn't say it all. It's really the beginning of a conversation to see how we can do better in this partnership effort. And why don't I start with a definition of what we mean by anchor institutions? Because many times when we bring this up, folks say, well, what about libraries? What about art institutions? What about the Urban Institute? Clearly an anchor in many regards. There were so many directions we could take. We really limited our focus to what Sarah was saying are eds and meds. So universities, colleges, hospitals, and medical centers. And they are critical for urban prosperity and cities everywhere. And as we all know, cities are awesome, right? There are many reports, many other conferences we go to. Cities are doing incredibly well. They're the center of economic development. They're the density. They have all the population density now. So cities are where it's at, and so of course they're going to work with anchor institutions, but we also know for those of us who work with cities and work for cities, and I see a number of you out there, that cities need help, right? Cities need partners, and it's almost impossible for any city. It is impossible, I think, for any city to do it completely on their own. And this report, as Sarah was also saying, really grew out of the work that I'm a part of, that many of us are a part of also in the audience at the National Resource Network. And the National Resource Network is an incredible program set up by the federal government to help cities that have serious economic challenges around the country. And so these are cities that have high population decline, high unemployment, or high poverty. And there are 300 of these municipalities around the country with populations of over 40,000. They need help. But really, all cities need help. And there's a recent report that was issued by Boston University. It's great because they have done a survey of mayors, which I don't think has ever really happened before. And they had their second annual review of what mayors have articulated as their priorities and their view of partnerships. And what's really great about this report is they asked mayors, how do they feel about their relationship and the importance of partnership with the federal government, with state government, with the business community, and on and on. And everybody who they polled ranked either a 7, 8, 9, or 10. Really, the lowest was a 7, which clearly signals how important it is for cities to partner. And as an urban policy professor, when I teach courses and talk about cities that are doing well and those that have struggled, it's those that have learned how to partner over the years. So the differences between a Detroit and its ability to work with and sustain partnership with the business community compared to a place like in Indianapolis, or compared to a place like Atlanta that's been doing pretty well over the years, which has the tagline of the city that's too busy to hate. And so they know how to extend a hand. And so really what we need to get a handle on are partnerships. And unfortunately, that business community that most cities used to work with has begun to flee. There's a lot of corporate flight, and there aren't that civic and business community that used to be in cities is no longer there, or not at the level that it had been. And anchors are the new city builders, right? So you look at any review of universities and eds and meds and hospitals, and oftentimes they're the largest landholder. They have the real estate. They employ most of the businesses and people and jobs, and they continue to grow and grow. So clearly, we have to understand how is it that we work with these institutions. And unfortunately, that's not a natural act. So again, many of you who work with and for cities know that it doesn't come naturally to see who do you even work with at a university? Who do you call the provost, the president? Is it the head of community development if a university even has one? It can be a bewildering process. And that's a mindset that needs to change for cities. And that's what inspired us to put this report together. So working with Urban Institute and the National Resource Network, we really set off on an enterprise to see how do we move from an understanding of anchor institutions as city builders to how anchor institutions can be city partners. And when we looked at the literature and what others have written about anchor institutions, we didn't find a lot of concrete evidence in terms of what to do and how to improve this partnership. A lot of what you see in some places is what I almost think of as prescriptive in nature, finger wagging at universities and telling them what they should do. And then on the university side, and I'll admit my home institution of NYU is somewhat guilty of this, you see a lot of fluff pieces in terms of what the economic impact is, the multiplier effect of having eds and meds in your local community. And so we wanted to peel the onion in terms of how is it that you really get at better partnerships. And so what we did is we identified 12 locales around the country that aren't the likely suspects in terms of understanding city growth and the relationship with universities. So we reached out to Waco, to Detroit, to Memphis, to Stockton, and many other places to see how this relationship was playing out. And overall, we were encouraged. 11 of the 12 cities that we surveyed said that their relationship with anchor institutions has actually improved over the last 10 years. We also saw a number of cities in which working with anchor institutions has become central to their turnaround strategies. So again, Waco, Kansas City, Kansas, and Detroit, and Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania are examples of that. And we also saw something that's a little hard to describe, but generally a more openness on the university side and the hospital side to see how is it that they make sense of a partnership with cities in a more holistic way. And so there had been a movement that was referred to as enlightened self-interest that a lot of people might know of as the Penn model at the University of Pennsylvania, where there's been a lot of activity over the last few decades of universities trying to improve the surrounding neighborhoods. Clark University also did this in Worcester, Massachusetts. But what we started observing when we put this report together and we're talking to cities was greater than that. It was really more of an interest not just in the surrounding community, but the whole city, and really about developing new, fresh, and bold partnerships. So some of the examples include, and we might hear a bit about it more later, the urban lab model at the University of Chicago. At my own institution at NYU, we created something called the Center for Urban Science and Progress, which is the first school in the country that was built as part of an MOU with city government, meaning we are building this school to see how we can help the city address its data needs and challenges. And so then we pulled back when we wrote the report and we said, why? Why is it that we're starting to see better, more holistic partnerships in the direction you would want to see it, that are really, in a sense, being catalytic to bring city and anchor leaders together? And some of this is, you might have heard the phrase, so goes the city, goes the anchor institution. And as I was saying earlier, a lot of cities are struggling. And without having that core traditional business community there, it's incumbent upon anchor institutions to do more to assist cities. Some of it has to do with this new fascination around new data, big data science, and new technology tools. And in many regards, data can be a great neutralizer, where cities and universities can come together and see how they can advance issues looking at data. And there's more of an interest from employers and from students to have real-world experience, and what better way to do that than in a home city? But I think one of the greatest reasons we're seeing more of this is there's more of a support network that has come together. So there's something called the Anchor Institutions Task Force and the Coalition for Urban Serving Universities, which President Vival may tell us about, where there's a place where anchor institutions and leaders can come together and talk about what their greatest concerns are and how they'd like to improve their connections to their local communities. And just as important is there's a growing awakening amongst the philanthropic community, right? So Ford funded this report. Casey and Charles helped to support this conversation. Others, including Living Cities and the Kauffman Foundation and Sloan, are really ramping up their support to this field and to specific cities. And Cleveland, I'm not sure if we'll have a chance to talk about the incredible work happening in Cleveland. A lot of that grew out of the commitment from the Cleveland Foundation. So with all this good work happening and this real pivot that we're starting to see towards more of a genuine partnership citywide between anchor institutions and cities, you might think we're there. But as the report also takes pains to point out, we're not quite there. I wouldn't say that this is now standard operating procedure in most locales. And there's a lot more that needs to be done. And one of the main ways to describe this is that a lot of the efforts, as great as they are isolated. They're episodic. Or I was actually just in Boston yesterday with a group of 10 cities that are working on data initiatives. So it was a gathering of chief data officers. And when I asked them what the relationship is like with their local university, the phrase I heard again and again and again is it's good. There's some great projects, but the phrase was it's a one-off. It's a great idea. It's a great initiative. There's promise, but it's just this one project. So what I'd really like us to focus on today, and what the report tries to focus on, is how do we make that pivot from isolated success to institutionalization of partnership between anchor institutions and cities. And to begin getting there, the report lays out a series of recommendations. And we very carefully looked at the many partners that need to come together, not just to help cities, but to make this partnership happen. So we called out the role that government can play, that philanthropy can play, and that the anchor institutions themselves can play. And we looked at big picture ideas, such as forming a compact or an agreement between cities and anchors that is binding and transparent. We looked at ways to improve the data understanding of what's going on with anchor institutions and how to better track employment, training of education, whatever the priorities might be for a local community. We looked a lot at the Affordable Care Act, which can be a powerful mechanism for not just holding hospitals accountable, but creating a framework to see how hospitals can be more connected to community development. And we also looked at leadership, which is critically important. I would almost say it's impossible to have a good partnership without the right leaders in place. And again, philanthropy can play a role even in terms of not just funding it, but stepping up as leaders themselves in different communities. And there are many other ways that you can get at this partnership. There were a couple that we didn't even get into the report. One, we were talking with a state where the largest city was having trouble making up revenue that it would lose to institutions. As many people may know, or some don't know, that anchor institutions don't pay property taxes. So there was an idea in this city to say, well, can the state allow us to share payroll taxes to offset the loss in revenue that we feel from property taxes? There's also been discussion of how we begin to change incentive structures within universities. How do we touch that third rail of tenure in a way that it's more oriented towards these types of partnerships? So many, many other ideas, and that's what our goal today is to see how is it we can make this framework of partnership a reality and one that's enduring. So thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for joining us here today, both here in this room and through the miracle of the internet electronically. My name is Charles Ruthhauser, and I'm a senior associate at the NEE Casey Foundation. I manage our national portfolio on anchor institution work. And many of you are perhaps familiar with the Casey Foundation and our mission. Our mission is to improve outcomes for vulnerable kids. But, and to do this, we do a wide variety of things. We do a lot of work around trying to reform systems that affect kids directly, such as child welfare and juvenile justice. But we also know that in order to be able to improve outcomes for kids, they need to live in strong families, and both kids and families need to live in thriving communities. And out of this last recognition, for more than the last quarter century, the Casey Foundation has been deeply involved in a variety of community change efforts, and Urban Institute has been a very important partner in many of these efforts over the past 25 years. Our interest in anchors comes from the important roles that we know that universities and hospitals can play in improving outcomes for kids, families, and communities. By deploying their broad array, and I'll emphasize the broad array of assets that they possess in much more intentional, strategic, and focused ways. And so for the more than the last decade or so, we've been investing in research, network building, innovative demonstration projects, and policy advocacy efforts to help anchor institutions be more positive forces for the equitable and inclusive development of communities. So we've learned lots of things over the last 10 years or so, but one of the most important lessons is about the necessity of partnerships on different levels, between anchors and their adjacent communities, between anchors and local governments, partnerships between multiple anchor institutions in the same city, between local and national philanthropy, and the set of relationships that help link and align all these different levels of partnership. Casey isn't alone in recognizing the power and potential of anchors. There are many others, the Cleveland Foundation, the Cerdna Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, Kresge, Ford. And with the assistance of the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, Casey is working with these and other foundations to align our investments and activities in this nascent field. So that's one of the reasons why Casey is sponsoring today's conversation about a report that Ford funded. This report is valuable, a valuable and important document for the field, and to, I think, spark a series of conversations about its findings. But on a more personal note, I consider myself someone who's fairly well informed about the anchor field. And when I read this report, I learned a bunch of new things. One of the most interesting things I learned that there were places, such as Waco, Texas, that had been gravitating towards these partnerships between city governments and anchors that I had not heard of before, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, as well. And today we have the honor today of being joined by the mayor of Waco, Malcolm Duncan. And he is joined by an equally distinguished set of leaders that have been involved in various kinds of partnerships between anchors, cities, and communities. Joan Quinlan is the Vice President for Community Health at Mass Gen Hospital. Vin Vivell is President of Portland State University. And David Eichenthal is Managing Director of the PFM Group. and Executive Director of the National Resource Network. Prior to those positions, David also had a series of senior appointments in city governments in Chattanooga and New York City. So we have a wide variety of perspectives here. So I'm going to begin this panel by posing a series of questions. I think we're going to have about 4 rounds of questions for the panel. And then we'll pivot to taking questions from both the audience in the room and the audience that is joining by webcast. And for those of us in the room, draw your attention to the cards. Write your questions on those cards. And those who are joining us via webcast, email at the address provided. So the first question I have for the panel is about motivation. What got you involved in doing this work? What was the impetus for your engagement in these kinds of partnerships? Mr. Mayor.
Before Baylor had a new football stadium or a Heisman Trophy winner, they had made a conscious decision to move their School of Social Work, both undergraduate and graduate, to downtown Waco, which at that time was still a struggling enterprise. And that commitment really was a visible sign to the community that there was a willingness to work together. 6 years ago, a graduate faculty member had a class do an in-depth study on poverty in Waco. There was a local group of citizens that were working on this, but when we got the research from Baylor, it opened the city council and the community's eyes to the impact of poverty on our community, and their research highlighted the specific areas that we needed to address on an immediate and a long-term basis to make a real improvement in quality of life. So without Baylor's work, we would not be where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
So good afternoon, everyone. And by the way, I want to point out that's a picture of Mass General Hospital from across the Charles River, so I feel right at home. So I've actually been doing this work at Mass General for an embarrassingly long time, 21 years. And I can think over the years that the motivations have shifted, and there's really kind of 4 points. The first was we started because the Massachusetts Attorney General passed community benefit guidelines. And they encouraged hospitals to take responsibility for health status in low-income communities in their service delivery area. So I was hired to do that. And the hospital did it. They were fine with it, but it was a bit of a box checking and kind of regulatory compliance issue. Then in the mid-2000s, we got a new president, and I know the report talks about leadership. Leadership is everything. He fully embraced this work. We changed the mission statement of the hospital to incorporate community health improvement. We formed a board committee on it, and he elevated, excuse me, my position from the director of the community benefit program to a vice president of community health. Then number 3 was the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010. And you know, you could kind of go through the motions. Everyone in the country, every hospital in the country has to do a community health needs assessment every 3 years and an implementation plan. You could kind of go through the motions and file it on a shelf, but we used it to further deepen our relationships in the local community, and I'll say more about that later. And 4 is that the motivations have really shifted now. The pressure on healthcare is to control costs. So if 80% of health status is as a result of where people, the conditions where people live, work, and spend time, then all of a sudden it's dawning on healthcare, we need to pay more attention to the conditions outside the 4 walls where the doctor does the exam. We actually have to get engaged in housing and food security, crime and violence, economic and educational opportunity. So I'll stop this.
Yeah.
In our case, Portland State University, it's also a long history. In a way, it really goes back to 1946 when the university was founded to serve returning veterans. And the idea was that we would go out of business after a little while and higher ed would return to, you know, sort of cloistered ivory tower out in the countryside away from the messiness of urban life. In other words, to the University of Oregon and Oregon State. However, that didn't happen. Portland State kept growing, but our sister institutions didn't really like that. They didn't like an urban competitor. So I think the reason Portland State began to really connect to its locale was because we needed it. We needed the partnership with the city, with the business community, with labor, civic groups to prove our worth and our value. That became part of the DNA of the institution and was really institutionalized in the mid-90s when there was a major curricular reform. And still to this day, I think Portland State honestly is one of the leaders in the country, the extent to which partnership is embedded in the curriculum, because all of our graduating seniors have to do a capstone project as a team with an external partner. It can be a business, a social service agency, a unit of government. So we run 240 capstone projects a year involving 4,000 students. That meant that all of our faculty had to create those connections with others. They couldn't be in the ivory tower. At the same time, mid-90s, we adopted our motto, let knowledge serve the city. And that has become just totally institutionalized. So from starting as sort of existential legitimacy reasons, it has really become the mission of the institution. And it couldn't be changed. So while leadership matters, it also has now survived God knows how many presidential transitions, mayoral transitions. It's no longer dependent on any one person to be actually implemented.
So I'll try and answer this in two different ways. So the National Resource Network, as it does work around the country, and we're now working with about 50 different cities around the country, is working with the most economically challenged cities. And as Neil pointed out in his presentation, all cities need support, engagement from partners. Certainly the most economically challenged cities really need it. Oftentimes the local governments don't have sufficient capacity on their own to prosper and be effective. So we go into every city looking for these opportunities. So that's one part of the motivation. The second, more simplistic answer to the question of the motivation are two names, Neil Kleiman and Erica Pothick. So in designing the concept of strong cities, strong communities, and the National Resource Network, this idea of engaging and leveraging partnerships at the local level was something that was baked in some of the work that Erica had done while she was still at HUD. I still remember quality time with her on opportunity assessments in places like Youngstown and talking to Youngstown State there. And then when we, as a consortium, came together to implement the National Resource Network, we decided that it was important to have an institution of higher education as a central partner of that, so that Neil hasn't just been a policy advisor on our work, he's been helping us to think through how that work gets done in city after city. I think the first time I spoke anywhere before an audience as the executive director of the National Resource Network, it was to the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities. So we knew from day one that we were going to be doing this because we needed to have those partnerships in order for us to help cities succeed.
Great, thanks. So on the subject of partnership, who are some of the key partners that you have been working with in this deep, close, and intense way?
Well, Baylor opened the door to local philanthropies. That we have 3 primary local foundations that, if we were going to work in a collaborative manner, had to rethink how their grant writing was structured. If we're going to be about outcomes and metrics, then we've got to start looking at those when we write a grant from the foundation standpoint, in lieu of just what the inputs were. So to communicate broadly over, Waco has several hundred nonprofits. We're overburdened with nonprofits. Now, how many file a tax return, I haven't checked, but we've got a lot of nonprofits, and to spread that message and to generate collective thinking amongst that group, we've had to engage all our partners. But the business community, the foundations, and the nonprofit networks all have to work together if we're going to make real change.
So we function as the backbone organization for 4 multi-sector community-based coalitions. And those are all the buzzwords in public health these days. And they focus on preventing substance use and obesity. So they're public health oriented. But their success relies on either the mayor, the city manager, or the elected leadership, if it's a neighborhood in the city of Boston, as well as, we have the wheel, the 12 sectors, the faith-based, business, parents, youth, etc. And it's the same as somebody just said here. We have a stake and an interest in reducing obesity and substance use, but we can't do it alone, and everyone else also has a stake from different points of view. So we work together on it.
Mm-hmm. We certainly work with a multiplicity of partners. I think the biggest effort started back in the 90s when Portland State co-invested with others in actually building the public transit system in the Portland metropolitan area. And as a result, we now have the 4 busiest transit stops in the region on our campus, both for light rail, for buses, and for the streetcar. I think it was really a matter of putting our money where our mouth is. That since has expanded to working with the city as probably the single largest partner, going back to helping them do their first comprehensive plan, their first climate action plan, having an urban renewal area, as well as a university district planning overlay for the campus, developing our economic development strategy document to really harmonize with the city's economic development priorities. We looked at, do we have the fields, do we offer the degrees that match the industries that the city is focusing on? Doing joint buildings. The city's historical archives are in one of our buildings. We're about to develop a new building that the city will be a co-owner of in a co-op condo kind of structure. Very importantly, creating the Cradle to Career partnership in the county. We took the lead, again, together with the then mayor. And one of the things we've obviously found is that the more you do along those lines, the more will be generated because you just have a multiplicity of touch points, so ideas come up in a continuing flow of information. But also our partnership with our local Oregon Health Science University is very important for us, and as a piece of city building. Together we control, directly or indirectly, a pretty big chunk of sort of the southern downtown. And we've created something called an innovation quadrant, IQ, being clever, where we will be doing more joint buildings. We already have a joint building. We'll have a joint School of Public Health. We got other partners involved in that as well. And the Health Science University invested in a pavilion on our campus so they can hold their big meetings there, again, trying to be more efficient about it. We also have a memorandum of understanding both with Intel as the largest employer of Oregon and with our local utility company. And I want to come back to this notion of having an MOU to regularize partnerships so it doesn't become episodic and just ad hoc. Cool. I'll leave it at that. I can go on for a long time about the details here.
So I think is reflected both by what folks on the panel have said and what Neil and the team from Urban documented in the Grand Bargain report. It really varies from place to place. It certainly varies from place to place in terms of the work that the network's doing. So Mayor Duncan can speak more articulately and in greater detail about how we're engaging with the partnerships that they've helped to create in Waco around the Prosper Waco initiative. But in Springfield, Missouri, we're actually very deliberately working to create partnerships and engagement and move toward sort of a compact approach between the city of Springfield and Missouri State. In Providence, where we're doing work around budget issues, and Neil mentioned the pilot word, so I won't be the first to get in trouble on this panel, but where some of the institutions of higher education and some of the hospitals have made financial contributions to the city, is cities looking forward toward a financial plan that ensures both budget balance and long-term success as a city. Those anchor institutions have been at the table throughout, and actually the Providence Foundation is funding part of the work that the network's doing there. So it really does vary from place to place. And the last place I'll cite, I think, is work that we're doing in New Orleans, where the network isn't providing direct assistance support to the city as it is in most of the other places. We're actually, through civic consulting, helping to seed the development of what's called a local resource network, where it becomes a systematized process where the business community and some of the anchors are working with the city on specific projects and toward this grander bargain.
Those were the easy questions. So this is difficult, complex, and challenging work, and I was wondering if the panel could share some of your experiences with these challenges, these barriers, the pain points, the things that keep you up at night when you are attempting to do this kind of very novel and innovative work.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is turnover in people, and not just elected officials turnover, but we're now going to be working with our third provost at Baylor, and so the initiatives have a life of their own, but the energy is provided by the people, and so we've got to be building a strong enough base that it can survive those kind of changes. But I want to talk to something that Joan mentioned, I'd forgotten about it, is we're now updating our community health needs assessment. The one 3 years ago, we didn't use Baylor for research or for data, and when we asked the local people why, they were too high. Their bid was not competitive. So I said, is this really about price? And so we get ready to start on our new one this year, and again, Baylor's bid is high, and we say, well, now wait, Baylor, this is important to both of us. How are we going to work together to accomplish both of our goals and have you be a part of this program? And needless to say, it's taken a lot of hard work and a lot of bending of wills. You have to leave the egos at the door. You have to leave your bottom line at the door and come together in the sense of partnership and get past the transactional relationship that we had previously to get there. And it's very beneficial. We both realize it's a much better result because of that work together.
They should be doing it for free. That's my opinion. Because really, it should be the community's assessment, not anyone's assessment. Right. So I would say trust, power, and money. So trust, you know, the politics of a wealthy institution in an underserved community just have inherent kind of power dynamics. And I can remember very early on a community meeting and a local resident standing up and saying, why are you doing this work? You know, what is your hidden agenda? Are you trying to build a building? Do you want to use us as research subjects? What is it? And it's taken years of just saying what you mean and meaning what you say, and never, you don't prove it once, you have to prove it continuously. So that's one. I think the money / power, because let's face it, money is power, is also very complicated and confounding. I think with the ACA, a lot of people think, and even before the ACA, well, your role is you fund us. And yes, we have resources and we should fund, but if all we do is fund, we're not in the game. And funding sets up competition in the community, sets us apart, doesn't change us at all. We're part of the community. We have to change too. So we invest in the priorities the community identifies and in those coalitions, community coalitions. And then those coalitions decide where additional monies, mostly leveraged outside of that, go. And we knew we had arrived. There was a time, probably more than 10 years ago now, in one of our communities in Revere, where the coalition, by that time they had a steering committee and a strategic plan. And a funding opportunity came out from the state. And in the past, the behavior would have been everybody competed against each other. Instead, they sat around that table and they said, this fits with our strategic plan. Who among us is the best applicant so that we can do this together as a community? It was like, hallelujah, we had finally arrived.
That's a great example. Although I am going to disagree with you. We can't do it for free. Because if we do it for free, who's really paying for it are my students through their tuition, because that's where the money comes from. And that's not right. However, we can sit down together and find money together when we decide a project is important, and we've certainly done that. I think the challenges are that at times the relationships can still be episodic and change when there is a change in leadership. One example of that we had was that under the previous mayor, who had come in just as I came in, we had designated they called it an urban renewal area. It was really a tax increment financing, which would bring about $30 million to the university over the next 30 years or so. And purely because He realized that we're an anchor institution, we matter. Then the next mayor came in, and for a variety of not crazy reasons, he wanted to really change the nature of the whole urban renewal program in the city, and that would include terminating the one with us before it had even generated $1. And we had to make it very clear to him through phone calls from friends and supporters that that would not be a smart idea. So we had to invest an enormous amount of time in getting a different system, which actually in the end winds up being better for us, but it did take a lot of time. I gotta say, in the process of making that change, it also strengthened our partnership because it made clear that this hadn't just been charity, there was a reality to this. The question of having, working together on some things, but then having disagreements on other areas. We have just proposed, or Citizens Committee has proposed, to institute in the Portland metro region a business payroll tax of 1/10%, the benefit of which would come about $35–40 million a year, would come to Portland State. So it would be the first example of a local tax directly benefiting a university. Guess what? Our local Chamber of Commerce is not jumping up and down with joy, even though we work very well with them, and most of the politicians are trying to kind of not have to take a stand on it because they don't want to, get on the wrong side of the business community. They also don't want to get on the wrong side of us. So trying to maintain productive relationships in 2 or 3 areas while you may be disagreeing in another area, which is going to happen, always requires a lot of wisdom on part of people.
Mm-hmm. So to emphasize some of the points that have been made already, I think trust and sort of this agree to disagree sometimes are just huge issues. I mean, as we've been trying to help with these relationships, we've heard things like, universities that have reportedly in years past say to their students, don't come downtown, right? Don't even come, right? So it's not even like, it is the core level of trust. We've also talked to university presidents and provosts who've said to us when we've talked to them about partnerships, they said, well, we spend a lot of our time in front of city council as basically a human piñata on zoning issues, and we're not quite sure where the trust factor is there. And in a lot of cases, these relationships just don't even necessarily exist. When we go into cities for the purposes of an assessment, it's mandatory that we ask to sit with community stakeholders, particularly anchor institutions. And we've had mayors and city managers come to us and say, that was hard for us. As Neil pointed out, we knew that the anchor institution was there, but we didn't even know who to talk to because that's just not something we regularly do. So I think trust is really important. There's another issue, which is I've heard that universities and medical centers can be big, complex organizations to run. And Mayor, I know a little bit more firsthand that local governments can be big, complex organizations to run. And we talked about this a little bit in one of our prep calls for this meeting, and Emily Blumenthal, who helped put together the notes from that, described it in a very academic phrase, which is basically everybody has their own mishigas, which means in Yiddish, everybody has their own level of craziness going on, whether you're running a city or a medical center or a university, and to try and compound that by coordinating and collaborating with each other is just very hard to do, which I think it goes to the point that Neil raised and that others have raised on the panel. If you just do it transactionally, it's easy to get distracted. It requires a sort of deliberate effort that's rare but important.
So it seems that these challenges have actually been enlivening and have helped the various partnerships move forward, even though they're quite real, and the compounded complexities of this work is humbling for us all. So I'm wondering, there are many cities and universities and hospitals around the country that are really beginning to think about partnering together in more robust ways and really thinking through these issues. And when you have folks who are sort of on the bubble, they want to know well, what are the most important lessons? What are the most important things that we really need to keep first and foremost in mind about how you actually go about developing and sustaining these kinds of partnerships? How do you go about creating trust, for example? But going beyond that as well, and wondering what words of wisdom out of your collective experiences you might be willing to share with our audiences.
Well, I think it's like any to get past transaction, you have to just listen. And so each side needs to be committed to listening to what the priorities and the goals are and where they can reach the middle ground. And then I've referred to it as Groundhog Day multiplied, because you have to, once you can reach that consensus about what you want to do, you have to be very persistent and consistent in your message. And you have to repeat it, and you have to tweak it. You have to be flexible in the sense that what you thought when you entered into the partnership was where you were going to end up, because it's 99% of the time it's not going to be there. So if you're not committed to the common goals and constant communication and persistence, it's going to be very difficult to achieve your goals.
And I would say we most recently discovered that one of the conclusions of the report is kind of look for the sweet spot, look for that place of mutual interest. And this happened over the last year or two in a significant way at Mass General, where the communities identified the opioid epidemic as their leading public health problem. And simultaneously, the hospital was starting a strategic plan and organized around the pillars of mission. Community health had never been in the mission before, but was invited in this time. So we brought our community health needs assessment. We convinced our colleagues within the hospital to look at the data of patients from the communities with substance use disorders. And guess what? Of course they had longer lengths of stay, higher 30-day readmissions, two things healthcare is increasingly being held accountable for. And suddenly what happened was a comprehensive new initiative to address the opioid epidemic, building on the community's work of primary prevention and early intervention. Now we have patient care and treatment greatly improved. It's a leading clinical priority of the entire hospital strategic plan.
A whole bunch of lessons learned over the years, because I've been at this really since 1979, so I've probably forgotten more than I remembered. But the key thing really is the regularization of the partnership, whether you formalize it in a memorandum of understanding or something else. What we do with Oregon Health and Science University, we have an MOU. The vice presidents meet quarterly, our respective vice presidents. Once a year, the presidents meet to get an update, separate from whatever other meetings we may have, to make sure it stays on track, that we have clear goals. We do the same with Portland General Electric. The presidents, our CEO and I, meet once a year. Our respective vice presidents meet quarterly to move the various projects further. And that really helps. With the city, we've not been able to do that. The mayors have always said, well, it's complicated, it changes over time. I think they haven't wanted to be, with the first one, we had a pretty fuzzy memorandum. With the second one, we said, well, let's just play it by ear. It's worked out well, but not as systematically. One piece of advice for anybody starting on it, of course, is that, in fact, you have already started. It's the rare institution where there isn't at least some history already of collaboration. Now, on the other hand, there's probably also some history of animosity. And one thing I find as an anchor institution that you just have to accept is that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon you until the end of time. You did urban renewal back in 1958 and you're still guilty. So you just have to kind of accept that often, especially when you meet with a community organization, the first meeting is just you being punished. And then maybe in the second or third meeting you get down to actual work. It takes work often. It goes back to this thing, Joan, that you said about, they should be doing it for free. There is a perception often, especially on the side of the community, less so on a corporation or the city, that you are the rich university, so you should be doing it for free, and it's all about what the community gets. And we have to spend time with people. Listen, I as a president do not command my faculty. They are free agents. If there is no benefit to them, you may get them once, but they won't ever come back. So you need to find how they get something out of it, whether it's the learning of their students or the article, whatever it may be. So it's got to be mutual benefit. The notion of multi-stranded relationships. Again, this is tough work. Projects won't work at times, or people won't get along. So the more tiers of connection you have, the more likely you are to be able to make it through the inevitable rough times. And money does help. Probably the best example at the national level of incentivizing this was the community outreach partnership centers that HUD had in the mid-90s. They gave, whatever it was, a couple $100,000 a year to quite a large number of universities. It makes people sit up and pay notice. We have a grant now from the Summit Foundation to the city's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability for that bureau to define projects that they need our help on. That has helped institutionalize a relationship that already existed. So foundations can make a huge difference by putting up sometimes not even very large amounts of money, because that's the other thing. Most faculty are actually relatively cheap. Most universities, we're in such dire needs, we'll do a lot for pretty small amounts of money.
That's
honestly.
good to know.
And finally, learning from coalitions. We've mentioned the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities a couple of times, and there are other examples, where we learn from each other and see the examples of what works or it doesn't. So there's a lot out there now to help people do this.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that I would say, just in terms of engaging with cities around this and talking to them, and I think as a former city official, I could say this, I think they're more guilty of it than some of the anchor institutions, is there's a lack of understanding of what we really mean when we talk about partnership. And I think frequently when you talk to city officials about partnerships with anchor institutions, they quickly come armed with a wish list. And that's not necessarily the best approach. If it's really a partnership, you should, both sides or all of the members of the partnership should understand not just what they want, but what they could offer. And I think that's hard sometimes. I think it's not necessarily something that city officials are prone to think about, but it's pretty important. And it goes to the issue of partnership, I guess, beyond just anchor institutions. It's something that, as we've been trying to encourage city departments to engage with other outside nonprofit partners or philanthropic partners, that you should understand that it really, for it to be effective, it has to be a two-way street. By the way, also not just with philanthropic or nonprofit or anchor institution partnership, it sometimes goes to conversations about the role of state and federal government and working with cities as well.
Okay. Thanks. At this point, we'd like to turn it over to Q&A with the various audiences. So thank you very much.
Pick a good one, Charles.
I am going to do that. While I'm doing that, let me pose, this is complicated work. And, it's often, we often say that complicated work takes time. And I'm wondering about what's the realistic time horizon to think through about this work? Because that also, people want to have examples of things being done differently, but there's a long tail that takes to sort of work through, especially in building and generating trust and so forth, before you can really generate results.
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind, of course, is that it continues to grow. You can start with a very simple, short project, and there's a clear, and it may be transactional, based on either a grant opportunity or a particular need, and somebody does a study. I clearly have a feeling that because I'm building on a 40 or 50-year history, that things go more easily, and it's easier to overcome temporary setbacks. But it's not like you have to wait for. None of us trust probably any person fully and completely. So there will never be full and complete trust. between whether it's a city government and a university or a hospital and a community organization. It's always contingent and conditional. So don't wait. And the same argument, by the way, goes, Neil mentioned the issue of promotion and tenure as sort of the third rail. When we developed this whole program when I was at the University of Illinois Chicago about making that institution much more a partner with its city, some of the faculty would say, oh, we can't do anything until we change promotion and tenure. Well, if you wait till that, again, you'll all be dead before anything happens. But if you just start doing things, you create a constituency for that change in promotion and tenure. That doesn't happen in the abstract. It happens because there are a lot of faculty who have begun to define their work in a different way, and people kind of begin to see, yes, that can be quality work, that can be peer-reviewed, and that can be replicated, and that's new knowledge, even though it may take a different form. So, just start with whatever is at hand, and it will grow from there if you have the goodwill and the leadership to make that happen.
Okay, cool. So I have a question here from Matt Titus, who's a graduate student at the University of Illinois, Springfield. And he notes, as a grad student, I'd like to see cities more involved in student researcher recruitment at anchor universities. Do you see a role for cities in helping anchors attract top talent?
Absolutely. The city has just partnered with Baylor, and this just agreeing for both of us to commit funds to a partnership to hire a recent graduate to not only increase retention of graduates, but to engage current students in not just nonprofit. I mean, Baylor has an activity where the students would go paint a house. So we want to take it to a different level, where there's internships, where there's actual community projects that are of a long-lasting nature that we encourage students to participate in. And then one of the things I asked this recent graduate what we could hope this leads to, and she said, there are universities like Portland State that have tenure determined by civic engagement. And so that's where we end up. But I think there's a big opportunity there. And it's good for the city. It's like David talked about, it's good for both the university and it's good for the city.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a perspective from a hospital on the talent question?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, we had guests come from the University Hospital System in Cleveland and talk about how important working with the city to transform that community was for them in terms of attracting staff and top talent.
Mm-hmm.
In our partnership with Oregon Health and Science University, their interest in establishing this innovation quadrant, which also involves the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, was precisely about talent attraction. That as a research hospital, medical center, they need to be able to attract the best and brightest. They thought that it had to go beyond the institution itself, but give a sense of a neighborhood where people would want to live and work and play. And so that it was very much around talent attraction.
Okay. So here's a question from Wayne Young of the Port of Harlem magazine. And he's interested in understanding what each of your organizations, your points of view about integrating the points of view of residents and citizens into the new communities that are developed or develop around or sparked by robust investment in anchor institution physical facilities and campuses.
Well, I think that's one of the potential pitfalls of the anchor model, is that it becomes between the elected officials, city government, and the powerful institutions, and at the potential risk of excluding the voice of the citizens, and that we all have to be mindful who do this work to make sure that there's a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. I remember being involved in a planning session with the District of Columbia government, with its universities and with citizens. And just like Joan was telling earlier, I remember some resident organization in Georgetown looking at the representative from Georgetown and saying, don't you dare come into my school and try to do something good. Don't you try to help us because you just want another zoning change. Right. If you look at universities, they're sort of, it's the Goldilocks thing. Some are surrounded by very poor neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods are by definition, and often reasonably so, very distrustful, because historically they haven't been the beneficiaries. Or, like Georgetown, they're surrounded by a very wealthy and powerful neighborhood, and they're really hemmed in a whole variety of ways, and you better work with them. At Portland State, we've been fortunate. It's kind of been, in between, so we haven't had that challenge. But the education partnership, the cradle-to-career partnership that we have is very much a grounds-up, talking to the residents, talking to the parents about what are the priorities for that partnership.
And then there are communities that don't have both the benefit or the shortcoming of having an anchor institution in their community. And a lot of what we've talked about here is about the relationship between an institution and the communities immediately adjacent to the institution. So what can be done to expand the reach and connection, and this is a question from Evan Davis, to work with communities that don't have the potential benefit of having an anchor institution, a large anchor institution like a university hospital, situated in its immediate environment?
So let me give it a shot. So I think that one of the things that Neil said in his presentation is particularly appropriate here, right? If we weren't talking about these organizations as anchor institutions, and we were talking about them as the largest employers in a city or a community, or among the largest landholders in a city or a community, that question seems, easy to answer, right? There are workforce issues that go beyond the immediate community surrounding a hospital or a higher ed institution. There are opportunities to engage. I mean, Baylor, Mayor, isn't in the middle of downtown Waco, but it's certainly close enough that you all have figured out how to make it have an impact. Same is true actually in my hometown in Chattanooga, where the university is not immediately downtown, but it's close enough that it could have a considerable impact. It's the supplier of talent to some of the local business community. I think and we've seen it in actually a city that we just finished an assessment where the anchor institutions aren't even in the city, but they're literally across the border from the city that we're working in. And it's clear that so many of the people who work there, so many of the people who may use the hospital are from this neighboring city. The fact that they're not in the exact same institute, in the exact same neighborhood, doesn't eliminate the need for the sort of partnerships that I think folks have talked about.
Let's face it, a lot of universities are located sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and there are quite a number of examples of universities like that developing programs that then work in another city. University of Illinois Urbana has had a very long-standing partnership with East St. Louis. University of Oregon, because they're down in Eugene, has worked with a variety of smaller and mid-sized cities in Oregon. So it may be looking at other places. And certainly most big institutions will work with the whole metropolitan area. We're certainly not just working with our neighborhood.
In Boston, we have the inverse problem where there's too many anchors. Yeah. And in fact, the challenge that we're just putting our toe in the water in is, can the anchors work together? And we're just taking early steps at that, but it's not easy.
Oh, no, definitely not. So speaking about process and evolution, we have a question from Janae Queen Nazaire. And she asks, like, once you develop the partnerships that you're working with, did the strategy and priorities shift with the shared result as you actually sort of got into this work, or was it something that was fixed at the beginning, or how have these sort of partnerships evolved over time?
No, it's vastly different, and it's much broader. It was a very specific engagement around a very focused study on poverty, but once you looked at poverty, then you had to deal with health, public health, not health care, public health, education, all the way from pre-kindergarten through post-secondary, and the financial security. So then it leads into economic development. So Baylor has had a role in not just facilitating the discussion, but offering suggestions and critical assets to that development.
Yeah, we found that the projects that we cooked up as part of our original community outreach partnership grant Most of those original projects actually didn't succeed very well because they were kind of cooked up under deadline pressure to submit the grant. But then the projects that came up as part of the partnership in the next 6 months or the next year actually were much more attuned to mutual needs and strengths, and those worked better. So yeah, it absolutely changes.
Okay, cool. I mean, one of the characteristic features of the institutions we're talking about here, the partnerships, is that universities and hospitals, they hire lots of people, but they also especially spend lots of money. They buy lots of things, from sophisticated equipment to paper clips. To what extent are the partnerships that you're working in or involved in are trying to use the power of procurement dollars specifically to support small and minority-owned business development and growth?
We have a program that's focused on that, but the truth is our internal executive committee on community health is just at the early stages of looking at, and that's why we brought in the folks from Cleveland in the Democracy Project to educate ourselves about, so how do we're trying to affect social determinants of health. So hiring, purchasing, investing, building is a powerful and ultimately much more sustainable way to affect those social determinants than some of the public health interventions, policy and system change that we've been working on. So we are in the early stages of considering that.
I think on that one, the private institutions have somewhat more degrees of freedom than public institutions have, both on our procurement and the low bidder rules and even on our hiring. We're just under much more scrutiny. We have to be pretty careful with anything that can be interpreted as preferential treatment. I think places like Hopkins have done a good job, some of the others. So I think there's still stuff to be figured out. How as public institutions we can do that more productively, especially in terms of targeting it with an equity lens. We certainly talk about the equity lens, but how do you do that without running into trouble with the law?
So Elena Beverly at the University of Chicago writes, can you expand a bit about the need for mutually beneficial, underlined relationships between anchors and communities, and what can be done when some communities have less capacities to plan than others?
Well, we view a big part of our backbone role is building local capacity. And what we do is provide some staff, but also best practices, evaluation, help leverage resources. And we've watched community after community take on issues in using the strategies and skills that they developed from working initially on teen alcohol use. And then they're applying it. And so it's all about building community capacity.
A question from Storm Cunningham at Revitalization News. How do your partnerships measure the success of these partnerships? What are the metrics that you let you know that something is going according to plan, or conversely going off the rails?
Well, it can be from the minutia to, we'd like to know how many graduates of Baylor stay and work in Waco. Then we want to know what has that done to affect the median income. We'd like to know about what the neighborhoods are where they want to invest. I mean, there's all kind of metrics that we can get, but we first have to agree on how we're going to mutually assess them. And that takes a lot of discussion because we both have different ideas about what's important, what data is important. So it's there, but it takes a lot of work, and then it takes a very transparent process to make sure everybody is visibly seeing what those results are, and then you tweak them to make sure they're what everybody wants.
There's been some really good work done on this, both by the Democracy Collaborative, which put out a big report on how to assess the effect of anchor institutions. I forget the exact title. And the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities has put out a report about once every 2 or 3 years based on surveys of our member institutions about both how they measure and then what have been the actual results. So there's good sources for this.
Right, and we track a whole host of public health measures. This is one of the benefits of the Community Health Needs Assessment. You make a plan, and then you all decide together how you're going to measure it. And we're also piloting a data platform that could be shared publicly.
Okay. Well, actually, to follow up on that, we have a question from Alyssa Doom at the Sunlight Foundation about open data and data sharing processes within partnerships. Can you give an example of how data sharing amongst the partners has been critical to advancing the goals of your partnership?
Well, we're working with Sunlight in an open data policy, and it's a lot of work, but again, it leads to a much richer engagement with the public when you have the results on a community dashboard. And then when you have the idea that we're going to hold each other accountable for those, whether it's public health, whether it's in economic development, there's a shared sense of responsibility that the data really is critical for.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
We've been working with the Urban Institute and its coalition of, I forget what exactly it's called, neighborhood data centers. And as part of that, we put together something called the Greater Portland Pulse, which are 50 key indicators of success in all the relevant areas of health and public safety and educational achievement and so on. Now, those aren't necessarily tied to any one specific partnership because they really cover a multitude. Now, the biggest, I think, empirical effort across the country has been around the cradle-to-career partnerships, the 50 or 60 or 70, however many there are now, that are modeled after the Strive partnership in Cincinnati, that are focused on the educational pipeline, and that are very data-driven, very clear indicators of success, and those all put out annual reports or biannual reports of success. And I think it's really a model for how you do this.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Jeff Alexander at the U.S. EPA Office of Sustainable Communities, and I think this is particularly a question relevant to Portland. As part of economic opportunity is the ability to get to and from work. How have these partnerships been invested in, or investments related to transportation influence your work?
Yeah, no, it was very important because Portland had become a very automobile-dependent city in the 70s and 80s, and then there was a big plan to expand public transportation, but the original lines weren't actually going to come to our campus. So then, this was well before my time. My predecessors were very wise. We're still paying off the bonds for that, though. It was expensive, but it's been totally worth it because as a result now, only 25% of our students, faculty, and staff come to campus using private automobile. And we're largely a commuter campus, but they all either ride their bikes or come by public transportation. I think it's 40% public transportation. And now we're the hub, so every new line also comes to the campus. So that's truly an investment that pays off for many, many decades.
In Boston, is there any? You have a great public transportation system I'm from Baltimore, so yes.
Okay.
Well, Baylor, in our case, Baylor contracted with our public transit system to provide students that live downtown a ride to campus, and I read the other day that we have fewer 16-year-olds with driver's licenses than any generation before, so it's obvious that that's how they want to commute. They don't want to have cars. We're not interested. I was telling Vim we had somebody from Portland State come and tell us we had too much parking, to the consternation of all our downtown merchants. But so we've got to have more people living in a denser urban environment, and public transportation is critical. And so now it's even reached the point that we have a partnership with our county government, which we were a traditionally rural county. We've combined the urban and the rural transportation district to better, and serving educational needs is one of the top priorities of that partnership. So it's led to really great work.
That is the other piece. It's built in free, our students ride the streetcar for free, and the rest of the system at a discounted rate, and we have not built any parking in a long time. And we charge a lot for the parking. Mm-hmm. Incentives and disincentives do work.
Cool. So this last question for the panel should have a drum roll before it. What's the next frontier for this work? And I guess this question means both in terms of your own particular local partnership or what you see for this emerging national field of practice.
I think it just gets deeper. I think we look at the commitment of each partner to the partnership. We further define our goals, and I really do think that there are mutual wins of very significant levels for the communities and the anchor institution. And I think it's just, in our case, it's just starting. We're moving on so many fronts that it's really a wide open field.
I think it's two things. I mentioned them both. One is I think the anchors have to partner. So all of the teaching hospitals are working together on cooperating around some parts of our next community health needs assessment, with the idea that we'll then work with our public health agency and some other community representatives to pick one issue that we work together on to try to move the dial. So that would be tremendous progress in a city where there's great competition. And second, there's already a clear interest at Mass General anyway to engage in the more traditional definition of anchor, to use our economic clout in a targeted way. You know, anchor institutions tend to be stronger in the the cities where the economy is not as good. Boston's economy is good, but there are great pockets. In fact, it has the greatest income inequality of any city in the United States.
We started the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities with the primary goal of getting the federal government to pay attention to anchor institutions. I'd say we still have only scratched the surface. We've been much more successful with foundations than with the feds. And I think the same can be said at state government levels, that there's a lot that different layers of government can do to incentivize these partnerships at the local level. So I see a lot more progress there. And still within the universities themselves. You know, it's not like every faculty member and every student in every university has to be engaged in this work, but the legitimation of it across the higher education universe, there's still a lot of progress to be made as well.
So in 5 years, when Neil and Erica and the urban team write the update on a grand bargain, they should be able to cite 50 examples of community compacts that have been put in place over that period of time, particularly in economically challenged cities that need it the most.
That's a great way to end.
Yeah.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Have such engagement on this important topic and report. And we have an equally engaging conversation to have with each other. Teed up by the first panel, and I think introduced us to a set of themes that we now have the opportunity to spend a little bit more time in the weeds with you all on and give you some more context for. So let me introduce the panel, and then we're going to get started with our conversation. So I am Erica Pothig, Director of Urban Policy Initiatives here at the Urban Institute, and I also direct the Policy Advisory Group. And I'm joined on the panel today, to my left, by John Aram, who's the co-founder and CEO of Next Street, where he develops strategic partnerships and guides new business development efforts for Next Street, which is based in Boston, but you have offices in New York and Chicago. And he's had roughly 20 years of experience in consulting, combining both financial and strategic decision-making with economic development. And then to John's left is Nancy Cantor, who is Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark. She was previously Chancellor and President of Syracuse University and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Michigan. So she will bring a wealth and a variety of experiences to this conversation today, and we're so pleased to have her. And then to her left is Ryan Friedrichs, who is the Chief Development Officer for the City of Detroit, where he is responsible for developing public and private partnerships around all key mayoral initiatives and philanthropy. So please join me in welcoming our panel today. Great. So as Neil described, and Charles in the first panel helped set the stage for, one of the main features and recommendations that we feature in the report focuses on compacts, city anchor compacts. And again, as Neil and the first panel described, this is about pivoting from a transactional relationship to one that can be sustained. But in this panel, we really want to get under the hood and identify the mechanisms that enable these kinds of compacts to both come together, but then to be sustained over time. So we have, in each of our recommendations that we outline in the report, we contemplate and identify specific roles and actions for the three critical sectors that we think are important to these partnerships. The anchors themselves, the public sector, inclusive of the city, but some of the other actors that we think are important, and philanthropy. And so in this particular recommendation that we identify related to compacts, we suggest, and I think you heard earlier, what those roles look like in relationship to the compacts. And we'll want to dig into those in a few moments. But we identified roles that national and local philanthropic organizations can play in providing catalytic support, and in some cases sustained support for some of this work to be held together. You know, the anchors themselves have a lot that they need to be putting on the table in terms of leadership and dedication of staff. And we would say equally true for cities is the identification of particular people, point people, that can be the go-to person for anchor institutions and others in these relationships. And we have one of those point people today. So we're going to be drilling into this a little bit more, but that's just to lift up the approach to the recommendations that we take in the report. So we focus in this recommendation on a couple of different features that we think are important to the compacts: mutual benefit, mutual accountability, and transparency. And so I want to guide the conversation we're going to have today, again, getting under the hood around each of those different features. So let me kick it off with you, Nancy. So to arrive at mutually beneficial partnerships, we've talked a bit about in the first panel around self-interest, sort of that's a pretty critical component of how people come to the table. So looking now to thinking about what needs to get put on the table and what brings you to the table and what keeps you there. And you are a noted leader, as I suggested earlier, in not only as a leader of a number of different academic institutions, but as a leader in the development of these particular kinds of compacts. And I'd love you to start us off by helping us reflect on what is a university's self-interest in relationship to these kinds of compacts.
So I want to take self-interest though and turn it on its head.
Okay.
And I think this is what was really brought out in the first panel, and we've used the phrase non-transactional many times. So if you think about what's the opposite of a non-transactional model, it would really be an interdependence model. And I think this was articulated in the first panel that in many respects, and Neil said it too, that for example, in Newark, where Newark goes is where Rutgers Newark goes, and vice versa. So at some level, you could define that kind of mutual benefit of being together and collaborating and creating collective impact. You could define that still in very transactional terms. And what I want to argue is that these things and the next generation of where these things really become important is when we stop being so transactional and start being much more genuinely interdependent. You have to forgive me, I'm a social psychologist, and in this work I say I do social psychology 24/7. So, you know, really what is at the core of the benefit is when you start feeling that you are not just in a place, but you're really of the place. That the nature of the relationship you're creating is going to define your identity as an institution and the ways in which you can thrive as much as it's going to define the future of, quote, the city. So as an example, Newark is obviously a place, for example, that is at the core of thinking of questions of race, of equity, of civic democracy. Those kinds of questions, which are genuinely questions of interdependent interaction, or the walls that divide us, when those permeate the kinds of partnerships you make, it's always there as an approach. Then you take on particular kinds of strategic priorities. So public safety, policing and community. You take on educational attainment. You take on creative placemaking. You take on economic development. But you take those strategic priorities on from a framework of equity, a framework of building civic democracy, a framework of coming together. And that's where the trust part comes in. Universities are really bad at this. Universities, as we all know, despite the great examples you heard about earlier, universities are really good at the cult of the expert. That's not an interdependent model. And what we have to create is what we call the community of experts, some with pedigree and many without pedigree, who come together around the table with a sense of genuinely listening to each other. The final thing I'll say on that is the best thing I ever learned in 10 years of doing this work in Syracuse was when a grandmother in the near west side of Syracuse, the 9th poorest census tract in the United States at that time, it's actually not anymore, thank goodness, but said, we were talking about what we should all be working on downtown in the near west side, and she said, Nancy, just ask us. We lay our heads down here at night. And that is the refrain that I use when I think about mutual benefit. Just ask us. We lay our heads down here at night. And the interesting thing about a university in a city like Newark is you could just ask us. We lay our heads down here at night. We are right there. So that sense of common fate, if you will, I think has to be at the core.
Great. Terrific, thank you. So Ryan, let's take this, if you will, from another perspective, from the city perspective. And as a city official working on the development of these kinds of partnerships and relationships, what brings you to the table with anchor institutions in Detroit?
Thank you for having me. Thanks for involving Detroit. There's so many different really innovative partnerships we have going on in Detroit. And to kind of lift up self-interest, I'll zoom in on one. One that's sort of an outgrowth of a program in the report that looked at the growth of Midtown Detroit that sort of had 29 years of flat growth and has had 3 or 4 of straight up growth. The next phase of that is just starting to happen in the neighborhoods. And so looking at what brings the city to the table, what is the city's self-interest, laid bare. In some ways, to take the language that Nancy had, I think the co-created, the mutual benefit we start with is population growth. That the mayor said when he ran, judge me by one thing when I run again, and it's whether or not the city has started to grow after 50 years of population falling. And that's a very hard goal. And I think even majority of the cabinet even thought maybe that wasn't possible. But the idea of a North Star out there for us all to sort of chase, that was genuine, that was ambitious, that wasn't sort of a layup you could do, that you required the neighborhoods to be engaged. Because you cannot grow the downtown and midtown fast enough to keep up with what you were losing in population from the neighborhoods. And you needed to keep the residents who were there, the issues of equity, the issues of long-term sustainability for businesses who've stuck it through. So it's an interesting mutual benefit of the universities that we're targeting, just to be specific. So last week we launched a strategic neighborhood initiative. The neighborhood initiative is going to sort of sequence 3 neighborhoods and try and replicate what happened in Midtown Detroit in these 3 neighborhoods. For time's sake, I'll just pick one. One area is it's called the Livernois-McNichols Corridor, 6 Mile and Livernois, which is right between the University of Detroit Mercy and Marygrove College, natural partners and anchors in that area. And then half a dozen or more community groups who've been laying their heads there for decades. 7 departments in the city. The CDFIs, the community development financial institutions that have replicated by the dozen in recent years, and focused on that cultural corridor more than just a commercial corridor. Really, the cultural aspect of recreating that area as one large partnership. raising $30 million over the next 3 years to try and dig into that neighborhood. Almost all African-American owned businesses right in that corridor. A very important success story when it will happen. I believe that it will. And the city's kind of naked self-interest in this is make real change visible in people's lives every day. It can't be plans on the shelf. It cannot be long-term change slow. It needs to be visible. It needs to be tangible, touchable, and make people feel that they are, the quality of life in their daily life is improving. That's what the city wants to see when it comes to the table. That's what it's kind of connected to that larger North Star, that larger mutual benefit. That's our self-interest. We made that clear from the beginning.
And as the director of partnerships, do you feel like you have to, facilitate people along, catch up behind that energy, or what is your role in helping to facilitate that kind of alignment?
A lot of it is bringing to the table, I would say, different partners who maybe worked in different spaces of the city. So there's the Southwest Detroit is another neighborhood that we're focusing on, as well as the Livernois-McNichols corridor. Southwest Detroit, heavily Latino population. You've had some commercial growth already, a different set of complexities in that area. And so the idea that every space is going to be, to take the words from your report again, co-created. And that's the key, is to not feel, even when you get into a neighborhood model, Detroit is 140 square miles. So even the size of Baltimore is a big city. It's twice the size of Baltimore. You take several cities and put it in there. The idea of Detroit, the scope, the size, the complexity of it, the energy, and how you use and make people equity investors in the city's recovery, how do you make vacant land an asset for those neighborhoods, that's actually different in every neighborhood. And so I think part of my role is plugging in different players in each area and making sure that will be a co-creation that fits that area, because it is night and day on an east side versus a west side versus a midtown versus a southwest
Great.
Detroit. That makes sense.
Thank you. So John, you have the benefit also of a perspective that's national in scope. You've been working on a variety of these kinds of partnerships over time. And I'm curious what you see as the essential ingredients of these mutually beneficial relationships between anchor institutions and the city.
Great, and I think you can really hear it. I know it's been mentioned several times today, leadership at the top of the list. I think you can really hear it when Nancy and Ryan give their overview of what that really means, is who has the power to really clarify what matters in a place and to convene their colleagues, other leaders around the table, and really get them to act, get them to invest in a common agenda, sort of this concept of shared benefit from shared investment, but really to bring that into practice. And I think you hear that through the panelists today. I do think resources matter. So the ability to bring the group together, to convene, to shape the issues, but then to have a common investment. And I know that sustainability matters as a part of that, but I also think that coming in and really getting this clarity around what does success look like? Ryan's comment around a very simple goal, but really bringing that and bringing that connection back to the issues that are shaped in the dialogue, I think can set those partnerships up for success from the start.
Great. So I think, again, lots of people maybe are curious about what these look like, lifting the hood on these compacts that we discuss in the report. So I want to drill now a bit more deeply into what holds them together, who pays to support them, and how, again, the how of how they get held together over time. So that, again, we move past this kind of transactional one-off into more sustained relationships. And John, you've been a part of these agreements. Help us understand those dimensions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And it's happening in different ways in different parts of the country. I know some of the colleagues from the CASE program, Chicago Anchors for a Strong Economy, are here in the audience. This initiative has been in practice for nearly 3 years now. It originated from the World Business Chicago Plan for Economic Growth and Jobs. And it really was a citywide initiative and has come together through a formal strategic plan that really articulates these issues and what matters. It also is supported very broadly by 15 participating institutions that all have skin in the game, representing all of the sectors that you've outlined here: government, philanthropy, the anchor institutions, the eds and meds, but also because they all have some skin in the game, there's an operating budget that funds staff positions that are able to facilitate and advance some of the programmatic priorities of, of the initiative. I know, Ryan, in Detroit, the D2D initiative has been widely cited. I know there's a similar coalition of groups that are around. Other types of shared infrastructure tools that have been developed, whether it's a Pure Michigan database or a shared supplier list. I mean, these are all some of the foundational elements that not only hold things together, but really help them make progress against goals.
What are their kinds of specific strategies? What are they trying? What are the goals that they have set?
There's a lot of focus, I know, in procurement, which has been discussed. I think workforce is another area, from a hiring point of view. Particular neighborhood development, whether it's in commercial corridors or others. So really, I think the groups have the opportunity to shape their own agenda and, to really kind of bring those co-created goals as a part of the coalition that they're forming.
Great. Nancy, I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think what's really key there, and you said sustainability, really, and how do you really keep sustainable strategic goals at a high level, but then break them down into particulars. So, for example, just to get nitty-gritty, I mean, in Newark, for example, we have the Newark City of Learning Collaborative, which is to try to increase the post-secondary attainment rate of residents of Newark, since education is clearly the sorting mechanism for the future generation, to try to increase it from an abysmal 17% to 25% by 2025. May not sound like a lot, but it's a lot of people that would go on an educational pathway. Well, to make that really sustainable and to make it work, we have 60 organizations together, all the higher ed anchors, the city, the college pipeline programs, faith-based organizations, the funding, local funders. But most importantly, we created not only the overarching goal of 25 by 2025, but work groups that really have particular tasks and goals, whether it's to articulate between 2-year and 4-year institutions, whether it's to think about the 4,000 disconnected youth in Newark who are not in their high school seats every day, who, as Raz Barak always says to me, Nancy, they're going to be more connected to criminal justice system than to college if we don't do something about it. So trying to figure out these different work groups that then have a kind, and transparency again, that have a transparent goal within their particular venue, but then it goes across and matches up to the higher goal. What's really important about these strategic priorities, like a safer Newark, or post-secondary education, or a cultural district downtown that's now thriving, is that they bring often the same anchor institutions to the table, but in different configurations. So everybody gets to learn how to work together and to create that sustainable interdependence, but with particular goals and a different configuration of the partners, whether it's in a particular neighborhood or whether it's a city-wide, and we have both kinds of collaborative networks.
I think that's so interesting, because you could imagine you take an idea from one other sector or partnership over here, and then you can see that. And
what happens.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So Ryan, John mentioned the D2D agreement, and curious, would love to hear your perspective on that, and also how that's been sustained in Detroit. I know it's been a model for some other places, and what you think the important features are that are transferable to other places.
So for those who aren't familiar, D2D is our local procurement program run by the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, essentially trying to get large buyers to local suppliers. That's the goal. And it has grown from, I think it was $550 million in purchasing up to about $900 million in 2 to 3 years. A lot of it is focused on specifics. For example, in the construction industry, it's pulling in these large developers and local contractors on the construction side and just saying, here are the deadlines, here are the dates, here are the actual concrete channels in to these programs, and then also having a lot of technical support for the ability to then achieve those goals, those entries, those points of entry. So some of it's there. The other is shared learning. So you have DTE, our energy utility, you have Wayne State University, you have these massive local procurement leaders who need to show other leaders how to do that. So there's some public pressure you can put on the other leaders, but frankly, those expertise are probably there. There are probably some best players in your communities who are doing this well, who have best practices, who have the systems down. They can teach the others to do it. So we can do a lot of that drilling down. I think that's some of the elements, being very specific, access points, being very conscious about barriers, equity issues. We just launched with JP Morgan Chase, Kellogg Foundation, and Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, access to capital issues, trying to address those head on. And to your point earlier about who pays for it, it's almost always going to be public-private money partnership. Even what I was mentioning earlier, the $30 million we're trying to raise for gap financing in the neighborhood program, half city or third city / federal, a third private and philanthropic investment, and probably a third on the corporate side.
Yeah.
So it's innovations that helps.
Cool, thank you. Just as a reminder to folks in the room, and if you already used your card, I'm sure we can get you another card. Jot down your questions. We'll be collecting them in a moment for our Q&A. And for those on the webcast, you can email your question to events@urban.org. So jot down your questions or email to events@urban.org. Great. So we heard a little bit in terms of the questions in the first panel, this issue around the mechanisms, I think, for accountability. And there was a bit about how do you measure them? Is a mechanism is a particular one? So I want to, again, get under the hood a bit more on the mechanisms for accountability once you have shared goals and shared priorities articulated, transparency. Mayor Duncan was mentioning earlier today that our report has served as a bit of a transparency around some of those agreements that people can use as a tool for accountability. But Nancy, I'm just curious what your reflections are on these points.
On accountability?
Yeah, and the mechanisms for accountability, yeah.
Well, first I run away from it. No, I say that actually not to be glib, but to say that I think accountability is the next generation question for all of these compacts and for all of this work, because we're way too simplistic about accountability. So we can do accountability in all the collaboratives we have going in Newark, because we have particular so 20% crime rate reduction by 2020. We like these kind of accountability algorithms. But the truth of the matter is, what we really need to hold accountable for is the collaborative infrastructure that we're building, so that when you get changes in administration, or when you get people coming and going, when you get new crises happening, when you get new challenges, that you can point to the sustainability of the collaborative infrastructure and how it's going to weather those challenges. And that, to me, is the hardest thing. And we've actually started thinking a lot about how do we assess the strength of the collaborative infrastructure itself as a tool of accountability. And one of the reasons that I emphasize that so much is that this stuff is very messy, hard work. We all know that. And so on one level, I mean, we can get incredible successes, and then the next month something will happen that blows that out of the water. And so if we don't have a set of ways of holding ourselves firmly at the table, if you will, then we won't make real progress. So for example, on even something as seemingly concrete as local procurement, so when we sit with Prudential, and we sit with Rutgers, and we sit with NJIT, and we sit with the city, and we sit with a whole variety of partners in Newark Alliance about local procurement, the problem is we've got to make long-term commitments to changing our procurement strategies and to investing in women and minority-owned businesses locally that will seed that procurement machine, if you will, for the long term. Otherwise, a new procurement officer comes in that doesn't care, it's gone. And part of this is having MOUs, but part of it is also really thinking about how you transform the business as usual of the institution so that you couldn't just have someone new come in and change that substantially. And I think that's the key.
So I guess what I'm hearing, and maybe just tell me if this is a correct interpretation, I think if I could characterize the inside-outside game. There's the inside game of you need to have staff who are bought into doing it, but the accountability, if you are in partnership with a set of people who understand that's a shared goal and that person changes,
exactly,
then that outside game actually is a mechanism for the accountability. Did I get that?
That's exactly
okay.
right. I mean, you know, it's a great social psychology principle. There's nothing quite like public commitment to make people stay at the table.
Yeah. And John, I'm curious, again, we talked about measurement. I'm curious what you, and having helped to craft some of these arrangements, what you see as the barriers to, especially the kind of procurement issues that that we've been talking about, but what you think are also the mechanisms for measuring those accountability.
Sure. Well, I think it's a foundational element that what gets measured gets managed. So setting that up front in terms of the mandate of the compact, and really making sure that the investors who are investing in a shared platform for shared benefit are clear on what that goal is. And I think once you have that, you can measure it. I think your comments around the sustainability of the compact itself is really valuable and hits right on. I think there's also very tactical measures that sort of can measure the incremental progress around business development or workforce or these kinds of things. I have a preference for a fewer number of really clear goals that are not subject to, you know, interpretation or otherwise. But at the end of the day, I think just being clear on what success looks like and then being consistent around tracking and talking about that, I think is the key for success.
It's interesting. I was in a conversation this last week around attribution and contribution around goals. And I think, so one thing I just think about in relationship to this discussion is sometimes these measurements are around outputs, like how many jobs, right? But maybe I'm curious whether, as you think about those measures, how do other features come into that quality of the job? Or if we're trying to improve a particular sector, is there an emphasis on a sectoral approach? Or how, and if you've seen any evolution in sort of what measures we're picking over time that might be shifting from outputs to outcomes or other kinds of things. Any? Yeah.
I was just going to say, sure, just we've done a fair amount in this area of procurement, and since we're on it, I'll go a bit deeper, but you know, a simple measure, although it's transactional, that you might look at is transactions, and I think that's a good one and very concrete. At the same time, once you start to peel that back, it's a lot more complicated than was there a transaction? Was there an actual attempt? Was there a connection? Was there a relationship? You know, is there a fit between the capabilities and the need? Was it competitive? So, you know, I think that, you know, with those types of measures, you're able to go deeper and really get at some of the root cause barriers as to why things may or may not actually be progressing. And so it's more of an iterative cycle of you know, being clear on what success looks like, but then also being consistent around finding ways to overcome barriers and drive to the goal.
Great. All right, so I want to come back to something that was raised in the first panel around the role of federal laws in facilitating, incentivizing some of these particular partnerships. So Joan talked about the Affordable Care Act, and we have a recommendation in the report that does focus on how to leverage this new requirement that nonprofit hospitals have for doing a community needs assessment. But we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that, but just another feature of that is that the law also opened up a wider field of activities that they can count as community benefits. So it both sort of made a requirement, but then also enabled people to incentivize people to perhaps invest in removing lead paint, for instance, in the certain neighborhood surrounding a hospital. So I'm going to come back to this kind of question around there are not similar requirements for universities around community engagement. So some of this really is about the self-interest. There have in the past been funds that acted as a bit of an incentive. But how do you see public sector actors at the federal, state, and regional levels playing a role in this kind of work and these kinds of partnerships? Curious, so you're part of the state. Rutgers University is the, and I'm just, reflect for us a little bit, at least at that level, Nancy, in terms.
That's a nightmare if you're thinking about really connecting to the kind of private partnerships that can really infuse capital in these projects. So states have to work with universities to be, especially public universities, to really think about, whether it's procurement or whether it's real estate development or whether it's land care and land use, a whole variety of examples.
And Ryan, you alluded to the federal role earlier, and give us a sense of what that looks like in Detroit.
There has been, I think, almost no area that we haven't been supported in by the Obama administration, by the federal government. I could pick a dozen right now. One of the most interesting, we just got nominated for one of those government innovation awards from Harvard, which I think will win. It's an incredible program called Detroit Home Mortgage. For those who don't know, the number of cash sales for homes in Detroit last year was basically 90 to 92%, I believe, of all home sales in Detroit were cash sales. That means you basically could not get a mortgage in the city of Detroit. And the reason is it's essentially a loan-to-value issue where the bank will only lend at the appraised value of the home, not above it. So the president visits, we take the president to our famous and infamous 8-mile dividing line road, point across to Ferndale, and it's sort of a wood sort of cheap house. You can get a $200,000 loan, no problem on it. Here in Detroit, you have a beautiful brick home, good stock. No one could get a mortgage on that home because most of those homes need a little bit of work, and that bank is not going to lend for that value of the home. So basically, we had a federal team and Treasury and a tremendously interesting partnership with local banks. This is the Huntington, the Talmer banks, the Flagstar, these local and regional banks that are willing now to put a $40 million loan pool, backstopped by Kresge, $6 million backstop for loan loss reserve there, to basically say, we'll go in for a second. If you're in Detroit and you qualify, basically, we're going to give you that mortgage. We'll give you that extra to do that fix-up. Sounds simple, but extremely complicated. Directly from Treasury, we had an expert who's on building these come in. We have a whole team from the White House, frankly, that sits in cabinet and helps plug us into federal programs. So it's some of the most innovative work I've seen. Obviously, the state is part of that too, but on the federal side, 80 buses. The vice president helped get us 80 new buses. First time in 20 years you're actually hitting schedule in Detroit on picking people up to get to work. It's a huge leap forward. So you pick the area, we can talk about the support of the federal government, but the convening capacity is tremendous, and the ability to solve tremendously complicated problems like this home mortgage issue, we've been able to get at with that assistance.
Great. Don, sorry, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say what really jumps out to me from the example is the unlocking of the other pools of capital, the catalytic component of that, and we see that in other programs as well, and you know, that's mentioned in the report as well.
Yeah. Well, and if I put my HUD hat on for a moment here and reflect a little bit on something Vim mentioned and some of the engagement that Elena Beverly, who's also here, was part of when she was in the White House with anchor institutions. And in full disclosure, my first position out of graduate school was funded by a COPSI grant that DePaul University got to work in the neighborhood of West Humboldt Park. So I know its benefits well. And then I led the office in which the Office of University Partnerships at HUD is situated, and that they manage the COPSI program. So setting that particular piece aside, I think one of the things that the Obama administration did really intentionally was to make universities an eligible grantee for a number of the new competitive programs. So not necessarily the specific program targeted to universities in these partnerships, but they said, when we're doing the sustainable grant program, the planning program, a university could be the lead partner for that, and that's what we saw. We saw universities being the backbone organization for the regional partnership, competing for that particular kind of award, and you see that replicated in a few other places. So I think there are some different ways we can think about how the feds can incentivize and support university community engagement. So I would just name that as one that doesn't get discussed a lot. But
and even the promise zones.
And the promise zones, too, is another example of that kind of approach.
Even though there's no direct capital associated with it.
And, maybe as a, maybe not neutral partner, but as a different kind of, with other kinds of resources to leverage, that can be in a very intentional role to play. Okay, so we have one last question before we turn it over to your questions, and I would just encourage those who have them to please jot them down, and we'll collect them and spend the rest of our time. But we have folks in the room, I know, and on the webcast who may be situated in one of the roles we're talking about today. And I want to ask each of you to give your advice to others who may be sitting in your seat about how to engage in this work. What have you learned over this period of time, and what would your best advice be to someone else in a city, at a university, or helping to facilitate these kinds of compacts? So let me start with you, Nancy.
So I'll say some things that I've said before here today, but I want to pull it together, and that is my overarching piece of advice for us and for everybody is to pay as much attention to the long-term sustainability of the collaborative infrastructure that you're creating. Whether it's an explicit compact, and that's the best, but even if it's a little more implicit, if it's a little less obvious, but pay attention to the collaborative infrastructure more than to the particular projects, because projects come and go, but the collaborative infrastructure has to be there for the long haul. And I think we all get swept up in the thrill of the particular project or the challenge of the particular project, and we forget that it's the ability to sustain those commitments from those partners over the long haul. And then related to that is to figure out how to create the synergies across the different content areas in which you have these kinds of collaborative partnerships. So for example, one of the most exciting things we're seeing is the relationship between the budding entrepreneurship that's created around creative placemaking and a university community arts collaboratory, creating then a whole set of capital investments in entrepreneurs who are local entrepreneurs and local artists. That kind of thing has synergy together, but the only way it's working is because we have struggled to get all the big anchors, Prudential and Rutgers, etc., at the table with the little, I guess you're not willing to call them anchors, but the little cultural organizations, the faith-based or the neighborhood organizations, and everybody gets that the decision-making is not being made by one partner. That, for example, and this is for a public institution, you have to really navigate this, but we have put all our actual financial resources on the table in the University Community Arts Collaboratory in the hands of a steering committee that has equal votes from local artists and local neighborhood organizations as equal to the big organizations of the university or Prudential or whatever. So that's an example of where we're trying to pay attention to building that sustainable, trusted organization, the steering committee, as much as we're paying attention to whether we get a particular grant for a particular project that day.
Great. Thank you. Let me go to Ryan, then I'll go to John.
This is going to sound terribly self-serving, so I'll try and elaborate on it, but I think roles or positions like mine are very useful. And I think they're new, they're still innovative. I've worked with partners in Newark and Philadelphia, Oakland, San Francisco. 21 agencies of the federal government have one now. And the reason is because none of these anchor partnerships or compacts exist in isolation. There's more like 7 or 8 interlocking slices that are kind of cutting together if you really were able to sort of visualize what I was describing that is happening in this neighborhood in Livernois. 61,000 streetlights we put up in the city of Detroit. That was a very fascinating partnership on top of our public safety partnership, which is also public-private, which is also the education. We just announced the Detroit Promise, which is guaranteed you graduate from a high school in Detroit, charter or public, you're guaranteed 2 years of paid tuition in college. These are all slices that are incentivizing that, chasing that North Star, that population growth. It takes all of these slices together, and it's hard to see those slices. And so that is the one unique role I've got. We've got about 39 departments and 6 agencies, and so somebody who is lateral to move across those and have that connective tissue as their goal, as their job, to wake up and go to bed every day and work on that is actually helpful to understand the complexity of these, because it can look a little too clean sometimes on the simple charts as to how it plays out.
Well, that's why we made it a recommendation in the report. So thank you for endorsing. Not self-interested at all. I think it's precisely because we made this observation that cities that have a person like you in them is what's a critical ingredient to the success. So let you, John, be the final say on this.
Well, these are great comments, and I would just say this is happening. As Charles pointed out in his comments, there's a lot of innovation in cities across the country, and not to recreate the wheel. Right? Yeah. People are learning a lot of different examples in the report and here today, and I think that there's a lot that can be applied to future work in new cities.
Great. Super, thank you. All right, so we have questions from you and from our webcast audience, and let's get right to those. So this is a question from Saskia Miller, who is a tech and social entrepreneur. And it's back to this tool for accountability. So, and maybe, again, lifting up the hood a little bit on this. Do you have a formal system or a tool for engaging citizens in a conversation about shared challenges? And if yes, how does this tool encourage citizens to participate in implementing solutions? And then, I guess, how do you hold yourself, if you have such a mechanism, and it doesn't have, reflect a little bit on that, how would you hold yourself accountable for that tool? And if you don't have one, what might that idealized mechanism or tool look like?
So I'm sure you have a lot to say. I'll just make one quick comment on that, which is, as opposed to a tool, we have built into each of these major content areas where we have collaborative infrastructure. There are citizens and community-based organizations at the table and citizen voices at the table in each of those infrastructures. And that's really the tool of accountability for the voice. And in Newark, for example, in terms of K-12 schools, which we work with in the Newark City Learning Collaborative, that's hugely important because the state took over a long time ago, and there's a huge controversy over the lack of citizen voices at the table. So the tool is not so much a published sort of process as it is actual participation in the collaborations.
And we've seen that in practice through community advisory boards, through town hall meetings, forums, through some of the examples that were mentioned. It's a part of the infrastructure itself.
Exactly.
There's probably 100 tools I could talk about in a city government. My background, Erica didn't mention much of it, but it's all civic engagement. Most of my professional background is actually civic engagement. I'm a tremendous believer in the value of it, and authentic civic engagement, which is sort of how maybe how people think about Google. What makes Google so incredible is every time somebody touches it, it gets better. It actually improves. Every time somebody interacts with it, it improves. That's civic engagement. That's actual true authentic engagement. I mean, just the highlights, we have launched for the first time ever in OpenGov. So we have the minute crimes committed, all public safety information is immediately available real time. All of our financial data is immediately available real time. Extremely important for a city coming out of the biggest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. Basically an IT overhaul in the city of Detroit. So we have an app we've launched, 20,000 people have used it, and to get into this app, it's called Improve Detroit. You can download it, take a look at it. It's extremely interesting because the crucible you go through as a department to get your department into that app is incredible. So that means you have to prove that you can respond in 24, 48 hours to fill that pothole, or whatever that citizen, that clogged drain in the street, whatever they're reporting. We're going to see that weekly at Cabinet. We're going to see those reports. And if you cannot show that you can solve that issue or engage that citizen, you don't end up in that app. So that's another tool. In terms of co-creating solutions, though, that was what I heard in the question that I loved. We've launched an entire district manager system. So there's actually 2 people. So much we're doing. I don't want to take too much into this. I love the question, but district managers who actually embed in every district and a deputy to engage citizens in the Blight Project. I didn't even mention Blight is one. We're doing 8,000 demolitions of abandoned homes in the city of Detroit. The next number 2 on that list in the United States is the entire state of Ohio did 1,000 demolitions last year. That's the scale way off of whatever has been done. That is all being co-created with citizens in those communities who talk to those district managers, identify those key burned and abandoned homes that we have repurposed, again, federal TARP funds to hardest hit funds by the hundreds of millions to go at these homes. And you've seen, which people didn't think they would see in their lifetimes, the home values going up across the city of Detroit, 20, 30, 40%, because of that co-created solution and that demolition program and many other slices with citizens.
So one of those tools that I love is something called Motor City Mapping. And if you haven't seen it, you should go online, because this was a great example of citizen engagement, participation. Absolutely. I'm guessing even some participation from students and anchors and so forth, who went out and plexed it. So did the data collection on these blighted properties that are then uploaded to the website. So again, a kind of a mechanism for engagement. So we have a question from our webcast audience that is for Ryan, I guess, but for everybody. It's from Jean Horseman from Interrise.org. How do you engage with unions around the requirements that contractors and subcontractors are union shops? Or how do you remove this barrier for smaller contractors? So I guess this is a city-specific question, but I think it's probably true for some of these other kinds of procurement efforts. And how does that feature, that factor come into some of these discussions?
It's a good question. I mean, for a long time, I know one of the requirements we had that I was, informed of in the first weeks of being there is that we were going to have monthly reports on the diversity, racial, ethnic diversity of the apprenticeship classes in the skilled trades. Mm-hmm. This has been a topic that comes up, for decades. And that not only were we going to come and create solutions around any, plus 50% of any project that's happened since we've been in, they're going to be Detroit hired workers. But we were going to track the long-term. I really love what Nancy stressed again and again and again, the long-term solutions. People come and go. Institutional structures are what matter. We are going to track those apprenticeship classes and the diversity that what people are saying they're doing. We're going to, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, what John said earlier. We're going to do that and be very intentional about it, and then transparent about it. And then put that in our dashboard. Here's what we're seeing. And sometimes it'll be red lights, sometimes it'll be green lights, sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it won't be. But I sense that's the essence of the question, and that is one of the ways we're taking it head on.
Great. Yep. Terrific. So we have a question from Adam White from the National Council of Nonprofits. In your cities, how involved are the smaller nonprofits? So I think you've alluded to this, on the front lines of solving community problems in the partnerships of cities and anchors. So Nancy, you touched on the importance of saying, just ask us, we lay our heads here at night. Does this approach extend to community nonprofits who are intimately attuned to these issues? And just sort of, Joan alluded to this too, there's a power dynamic that goes when we're talking about compacts that are like, maybe we've described them as two ways, and I think that we've had a number of questions about where does community voice fit into this, where is community engagement? Smaller nonprofits are one feature of that voice, and if you could reflect on that for a bit, that'd be great.
Well, it's absolutely critical in Newark. Every single one of our major collaborative efforts, whether it's Strong, Healthy, Safe Neighborhoods, Safer Newark Council, City of Learning, our Industrial Solutions Center, our Urban Entrepreneurship Collaborative, all of them have very small community-based organizations and neighborhood-embedded community-based organizations at the table. Having said that, that doesn't immediately solve the issue of voice and power that Joan was talking about. I mean, and so we have to constantly go back at those organizations and make sure that in fact they're feeling and getting voice in the actual decision making, because they're rarely going to bring as many resources to the table as the large-scale anchors can do. One of the best examples I can give on that is that Newark has a very thriving, small, community-based set of arts organizations ecosystem, and they, at first, were extremely worried about Rutgers Newark taking on taking creative placemaking as so central to our work in the city, and I was sort of stunned. Why would you? We're putting arts and culture at the centerpiece, which most places don't do. Why would you be? And they said, because you're going to get the grants from all the funders that we're used to living on. And so we have to be really careful that nonprofit organizations, especially in the arts and cultural realm and in the faith-based realm, get as much funding through our collaborations as they can, or they won't survive. And it goes back to that long-term survival. The one other thing I would say on that, because I really care passionately about how we give voice to community-based organizations, is that in many of our interventions in public health, for example, in neighborhoods, it is only because the community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, retired nurses organizations, are at the table that any of the interventions work. I mean, we would not, Rutgers Biomedical Health System and our neuroscientists would not be able to make progress on African American Alzheimer's disease if we didn't have a whole set of retired black nurses who are in the faith-based organizations doing the actual work. So I think we cannot, you know, we sometimes, when we use the words eds and meds, I sometimes shudder because it can't be all about eds and meds.
Great. Ryan?
Very quickly, I just want to mention one of the more interesting things we've done with land in the city of Detroit. Our land bank is, 97,000 properties into it. We're actually giving that to block clubs. So it's a program that we don't want that land. We just hired a city planner, Maurice Cox, a brilliant planner who is working on that master plan for the city and growing off previous public-private partnerships on a city plan. But in the meantime, we want neighborhood and block clubs, the smallest of the small, to actually decide what to do with those lots in the neighborhood. We've sold them to neighbors. We actually sell that lot you've been mowing for decades to you for $100. People will come and they'll say, "Oh, apologize for waiting in line for 5 hours." They're like, "I've been trying to get this for 20 years." This little block, $100. People have bought them by the thousands. So the idea of land actual acquisition by neighbors, that's by the person, doesn't get any smaller than that. But actually, the block then controlling and voting. If two neighbors want it, that block decides who gets it because they know who's been maintaining it. They know, that decision at the most democratic way is a real innovation that I've liked in that same thread.
Yeah.
Cool. John, I want to direct this next one to start with you and invite others to weigh in. So Ellen McCarthy from Georgetown University, a local anchor institution here in the District of Columbia, would love some examples of who and what type of entities have originated these compacts and what types of resources were required and at what level. And maybe just use the case example that you mentioned earlier as an exemplar of like, how did that happen? How did that come to be? And Elena can fill in any additional details too. So
sounds great. Well, I mentioned the World Business Chicago Regional Economic Development Growth Plan. It had 10 strategies it laid out. Strategy number 9 was around neighborhood development, citywide, but specific targeted neighborhoods. And the CASE program really became an implementation commitment of that plan that really came from 2 people. We talked about leadership, the role of Derek Douglas, Vice President of Civic Engagement at University of Chicago, And Julia Stash, now president of the MacArthur Foundation, at the time was really overseeing some of the work around the implementation of the plan, really came together and said, we need to do this, but we need to do it citywide. And so they made the calls to the other institutions, really got around a table and made commitments to put in place a governing body, a steering committee, funding the Polk Brothers Foundation, and a few others stepped in, the role of philanthropy, and really created a plan. As I mentioned, a strategic plan, an operating budget, a set of programs, really focused on these issues of business development, but also workforce in other areas of place-based neighborhood development.
And do the universities or members pay dues into that, or they make contributions to the operating budget?
They do, and they have, and I know to the point of looking at different models of funding. I think there's a blended model through different stakeholders, but all of the sectors are represented, and they've all contributed in meaningful ways.
So just to give people a flavor, do you know what the operating budget is offhand for CASE?
Alex is here. I think in the sort of the mid six-figure range, I'd say.
Okay. So that gives you, hopefully, Ellen, wherever you are, some context for, that's a regional, right? So that's a partnership among the variety of different stakeholders is one example. Do you have, Nancy or Ryan, any other examples of sort of, again, how do these happen and then what it takes to sustain them? You've talked about the infrastructure for those being a critical component. What does it cost to actually carry that infrastructure and who contributes to it?
So our Newark City of Learning Collaborative, which has 60 organizations at the table, began actually with an impetus from the Prudential Foundation and a variety of other funders, local funders, and then quickly the backbone organization for it became Rutgers Newark's Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies. But that's simply a backbone into which we all put not only in-kind resources, but put grants and funding that we raise. But having the funders at the table was really critical to the initiating of that, and has been very important in sustaining it.
Great. So I'll take two more questions before we turn to Charles for wrap up. And this last one is about the role of public safety and how you address issues related to safety, which I think, especially in the history, but even currently can definitely be an issue, while promoting innovative partnerships to invest in economic opportunities for the community. So reflect a bit on that for us.
I'm happy to start. So there's a lot of my time is spent in this space. I'll pick up 3 initiatives very quickly and try and hit them all. The first is just your basic, you call it summer jobs in most places. Summer jobs grow Detroit's young talent. When we started it, public safety immediately goes up. In terms of violent crime, immediately goes down. 8,000 people were putting to work this summer. No surprise. If you have to be at work at 8 a.m., you're not going to be out at midnight, getting into trouble. So that the economic opportunity in the positive sense helps with public safety. The ceasefire program we rolled out, which is, for those who know that space, David Kennedy's work. For 3 decades he's worked on ceasefire. It's a deep public-private partnership. The Kellogg Foundation, Skillman Foundation, others have helped roll it out. Happy to talk in detail if you're interested. But ceasefire is working, and dramatic drops in public and violent crime in 9th and 5th precincts when we rolled it out. The Greenlight Project is our most innovative and last one. It's basically a partnership with the places that have the most crime. 50% of all crime in Detroit happens within 500 meters of a gas station. So we can talk about why or how, but that's the reality of it. So a partnership with these gas stations to light them, to invest in the public infrastructure, to give them HD cameras that sync in real time with our police department, not days later with gritty stuff you can't read, and letting people know about it. So the neighbors know. You put this green light symbol on this gas station. We want to rolling it out now that 40, 50 businesses want to do this with, convenience stores, all these other places, and then it's known as a safe place to be. It's known as a place that is in cooperation with our DPD and with the community leaders. So 3 really innovative, and all of them have seen dramatic, measurable decreases.
Cool.
Yep.
So Nancy, I'm saving this last one from you because this is from a Rutgers grad, Brian Berry, and he's watching on the webcast. Hello, Brian. Thank you for your question. And so he has a setup and then he has a question, and it's a nice one to, I think, to end this part of the conversation on, and hope it continues in other venues. So both anchors and government can experience leadership or administrative changes that run the risk of negatively impacting the relationship. And we've alluded to that in a couple different ways in terms of what turnover can do. So it therefore appears, says Brian, that a culture focused on collaboration and interdependence and mutual benefits is essential to ensuring long-term success, and I think you've said this. So Brian wants to know, though, and I think from a leadership perspective, how one actually goes about creating that kind of culture, altering an existing culture, implementing a new culture within a large bureaucratic, I mean, this is something anchors share in common with cities. They're large bureaucratic organizations, and I often reflect, there's the B team. They'll be there when you get there. They'll be there when you leave. So how do you change the incentives for that team of people who need to sustain the culture, even as leaders may come and go? And one that especially takes on the idea of evolving these relationships. So I'll let you reflect on that, but certainly if others want to jump in on that too, please do. And
well, I mean, let me just say that I do think that's the million-dollar, if not multi-million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's a question I and many others are giving lots of thought to, and it's really about what I would call the outside-in institutional transformation that has to happen with an anchor. So when we did strategic planning, when I came to Rutgers Newark, we literally did an extraordinarily time-consuming democratic process of strategic planning, all focused around the question, what does the public need of Rutgers Newark? What does Rutgers Newark have to be for the public in this point in time? We then have tried to do institutional transformation based off that question in a way that would sink anchor institution work right into the center of all that we're doing. Our executive team, the kinds of collaborative seed grants we give to faculty to do high-impact, publicly engaged scholarship, the ways in which we commit to a steady stream of Newark residents having access to and educational opportunities in the institution. So at every level, trying to take that outside-in perspective and sink it into the norms and practices and incentive systems of the institution itself. That's tough work, not easy, and it's going to be a long-term process. And you know, the thing that you fear the most is when you get the call, as we all do, that one of your really important people just got wooed away, right? And what do you do with that? And the answer is that we always have to keep in mind bringing talent in that will be both trusted in the broader, in our case, greater Newark community, and that will have some credibility of doing this work inside the institution. I mean, so I think one of the pitfalls for anchor institutions is to forget that we have to change as institutions to do this work, that it's not just about making change in, let's say, a city. It's also about changing ourselves.
Well, that's a terrific self-reflective point to conclude this conversation on. And please join me in really thanking our panel for such an engaged conversation. I'm going to ask Charles now to come to the podium while we get off the panel for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Erica. And thank you for being here. Before I worked in philanthropy, I was an anthropologist who conducted research in American cities. And in the early 2000s, I was doing a project in a neighborhood adjacent to a very large university in a major northeastern city. And I was interviewing a community leader. And in the course of our conversation, I just happened to refer to that university as an anchor institution. And mind you, this is back around early 2000, late 2002, early 2003, right after Michael Porter, coined the term in his oft-cited article. But, that article had not really gotten much circulation and currency beyond a very small sector of academics and anchor institution leaders. And she looked at me really oddly, and she, sort of like, she went like, huh, anchor institution. And she goes, that's weird. And she goes, well, no, actually, that makes a good deal of sense, because an anchor is something that gets dropped on our heads. And she was not wrong. She was not wrong at that time at this particular university, which will remain nameless. And it's not unlike many other universities in inner city neighborhoods and older industrial cities around the country. Relationships between the university and the surrounding community were, to put it politely, not good. Okay, and in many cases, for many reasons, universities since the late 1960s, those who had not gotten COPC grants in particular, had made a real emphasis on turning inward and drawing a lot of lines and erecting walls and throwing some sharp elbows and operating with a heady hand. Add your metaphor. And relationships were not good. And you could sum up the relationship on both sides in terms of distrust, suspicion, and anger. And I interviewed a lot of people, both within the institution and outside, and I found confirmation of this. So one of the things that has really heartened me tremendously is that over the last decade, at this particular institution and at many other places around the country, the term anchor now has a much more positive meaning, and one that talks about being an anchor of stability, something that can help a community grow and improve conditions. But I think at this point, not to get down into definitions, but being a former academic, I do get sometimes caught up with words, because both Neil and Nancy mentioned this, is why do we refer to universities and hospitals, eds and meds, as anchors above all others? And in some ways, I think this is partly an artifact of our language when we take a term that in general use that has many meanings, and then we give it a very specific meaning. And it can be confusing, it can be off-putting, because if we think about anchors as a continuum, and at one end or extreme of the continuum, you have resident associations, community-based organizations, parks, it could be a bar, it could be it's a cafe. These are places that could not really be located anywhere else. And their function is to sort of knit the community together, the fine threads of daily exchange, on a regular basis. This is the creation of important bonding and bridging social capital. And they are as anchoring of a community as anything else. On the other extreme of the continuum, what you have is something like an international airport, which is a giant sunk investment. You don't get any more sunk than this. You can move some airports, but it's a big thing. They usually stay in place, and they grow, and they expand, and they're billions of dollars investment. They employ directly or indirectly hundreds of thousands of people, and they serve not a small neighborhood. In fact, they're very bad things to be right next to, but a giant region, and they play a very important role, but they have nothing even remotely associated with a social mission. Their functions lie elsewhere. So here you have this big extreme. Universities and hospitals sort of lie in the sweet spot or the happy space in this continuum. They are big institutions. They buy a lot of things, they own a lot of land, they employ a lot of people, and they do lots of important stuff, educating people, keeping people healthy, and so forth. Their core business. So they have a mixture of both the big sunk investment as well as the social mission that is built in to their very existence. And I think that's one of the things why I think a lot of the conversation about anchors has fixated and focused on eds and meds. And it makes a good deal of sense, but as Nancy mentioned, the important thing is about trying to instantiate the relationships between and among these different kinds of anchors in some kind of equitable, effective way. And that is a really tall order. And I think many of the examples that we've heard about today show that there are many opportunities and possibilities where this is taking place. And the world of philanthropy and foundations, I think, have a very important role, or a series of roles to play in enhancing and making sure this work is successful. And it's not a one and done. I mean, my one reservation about the title of the report, a grand local bargain. A bargain is a transaction. It's something that happens. This is an incredibly long, difficult, enduring process. You'll never be able to go and say, you know, victory has been achieved, and we can, it constantly has to be sort of resolved on a daily, weekly, annual basis as institutions change, as conditions change, as the people who play key leadership roles in the institutions change. And getting that right is really important. And I think foundations can, and actually are, doing a number of things that speak to the recommendations in the report. For example, in supporting citywide anchor compacts, or maybe not even compacts, but collaborative efforts. We've heard a bit about CASE in Chicago, but I think another really good example where a national philanthropic organization has catalyzed best practice, working with local foundations, has been the Living Cities Integration Initiative, which was launched back in 2011 in Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Newark. And Living Cities didn't set out to really make this a sort of anchor-centric piece of work, but the efforts in Baltimore, Cleveland, and Detroit all had anchor institutions at the center. And Minneapolis, St. Paul, actually, they got it for the Central Corridor Initiative, which is a transportation project linking Minneapolis and St. Paul. But the McKnight Foundation and others working on the Central Corridor project were quick to take the lesson from Baltimore, Cleveland, and Detroit and go, we have more than a dozen universities and hospitals in our corridor. We haven't really engaged them intentionally and systematically. And over the last few years, they've become an incredibly important part of that initiative. And the McKnight Foundation has played a tremendously important role in sparking that, in catalyzing that kind of ongoing relationship, and is, I think, a great example of the kind of work that we're looking at here. In Baltimore, where I live and spent a lot of time working, the integration initiative, the integration partnership, has really grown dramatically from those early years of 2011 when it involved just two anchors, Johns Hopkins and the Maryland Institute College of Art. It has currently evolved into a collaborative table of 14 of the largest universities and hospitals, the largest employers and economic engines in the city, that are coming together focused around how do they go about working to improve inclusive economic development around targeted hiring and especially targeted procurement and capital investment. And it has attracted very active partnership from city government, from state government, and from a series of other foundations rooted in Baltimore, not just Casey, but the Association of Baltimore Area Grant Makers, Goldsecker, and others. And then just let's see, 3 weeks now, 25 of the largest private employers in the city of Baltimore have joined with Johns Hopkins in a very ambitious effort to ensure that they're going to do some very intentional and targeted local procurement and hiring in their efforts to the tune of about $70 million to start. So getting beyond eds and meds to those businesses who see, you know, a city as their home and are committed to stay is a great example of how this gets beyond eds and meds and really can't, if it's going to be successful, just be limited to these kinds of institutions. Another area where philanthropy, and in particular Casey and others, have been successful is in this whole notion about measuring and evaluating, capturing the effect of anchor work. And going back several years ago, my senior leadership team approached me and said, you know, we've been investing in anchors for quite a bit. What can you tell us about the impact on kids and families in the communities where these institutions are located? And I go, that's a very difficult question to answer, for a lot of perfectly valid reasons. And they understood those, and they go, can we actually do something about that? So I reached out to the Democracy Collaborative, headquartered here in Maryland, and asked them, can we actually think about how we might be able to go and develop some generalized field standard approaches for beginning to capture the incredibly complex kind of impact of anchor work. And they put their minds to it. They interviewed over 75 leaders from academic institutions to hospitals to communities to development intermediaries, and they came up with a concept plan for what they called the Anchor Dashboard. And they took it around through the various and sundry networks that link the anchor field, and it actually caught the attention of a number of institutions. Chancellor Cantor was one of the first who said, you know what, I want to partner with you to pilot this, to see if we can actually go from concept to reality. And over the last 2 years, it's been a very long and very interesting journey, because if you think about this in terms of, say, the design of a jet airplane, and this probably dates me, of course. Why would airplanes be anything other than jets? And, you start with these wonderful watercolor and pastel renderings of what something looks like. And then when you actually get down into the engineering and the schematics, you do wind tunnel testing to see if there's some drag, whether or not the atmospheric conditions are going to support this thing, whether something has at least a theoretical possibility to fly. And then once you get beyond that, when you figure about the envelope and you deal with the questions of drag, you really get down into the serious engineering of the mechanics. You think about the vehicles that these dashboards are going to sit in, and you make a prototype. And that's what's going on now and going on this year. And hopefully the prototype and the successful flight testing of it this year will lead in 2017 to something that can be shared with the field as a whole. One other example that I want to talk about, and not the sound of self-serving, but something that Casey has been doing in terms of building networks between and among anchor institutions. Faith-based universities have been historically a set of institutions that haven't been central to the anchor conversation, not central part of the anchor institution task force, but we were approached by Seattle University out in Seattle, a Jesuit institution, that had done tremendous work around community engagement and youth development. And they had heard from some of their peers on the West Coast, faith-based institutions on the West Coast, about what they've been doing and what they've been learning. So we provided resources for them to document and share their lessons. And that has evolved into a very robust and enduring network of 13, mostly Jesuit, but not all institutions on the West Coast that are actively sharing their lessons. So this is an example, I think, of talking about building the connective tissue, because one of the challenges in all of this work, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that rests within the heads of the people that have been doing this work for more than 20 years, from the days of the COPC program on to now. And in many cases, that information remains in people's heads only. There are some things that can be transferred into white papers and case studies and thrown up on a web page, and those are very, very useful. But very important knowledge, set of knowledge, is the tacit knowledge in people's heads, and the only way to really share that information between and among people is to do this in face-to-face interactions within relationships of trust and some degree of security, where you can actually learn and figure out something before it gets burdened by, you know, the politics of the real. And that's a very important part of the infrastructure that Casey and other foundations are investing in. And it's something I think that the Urban Institute and other key actors and players can play an important role in advancing to the future. So I can go on for a long time, but I won't. And I'd like to close by thanking Erica and Liza and Emily and everyone at Urban Institute for organizing an absolutely wonderful and incredibly professionally organized event. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And as you can see, we had a wonderful sponsor of this event who himself is an expert. And thank you, Charles, for those really terrific remarks helping to flesh out this model. Thank you all for your participation today and on the webcast. We appreciate your being part of the conversation. And just to echo Charles's remarks, this event would not have been possible if we didn't have the report. So thank you, Neil, for your partnership and foundation for this work, and to Liza and to Nancy Pindis, if she's here, who's also a co-author, and Liza, who's a co-author, and to Emily, who was the engine behind the event. So thank you, everyone.